Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping into a time so harsh and unforgiving that surviving just 24 hours could feel like an impossible challenge. The Middle Ages, life back then wasn't like anything we know today. Disease, hunger, violence, and danger lurked around every corner, making each day a fight just to stay alive. Imagine waking up to streets filled with filth, no clean water, and threats not only from other people, but from nature itself. This sleeping story will take you deep into the brutal reality of medieval life, revealing why even a single day was a test of endurance and luck. If you want to truly understand the struggles of our ancestors and experience history in its rawest form, this 2-hour journey is for you. So before we dive in, please subscribe, share your location in the comments, and stay with me until the very end, because this is a story that will change how you see the past forever. The first light of dawn barely filtered through the narrow, winding streets of the medieval town, casting long shadows over the uneven cobblestones. The air was thick and heavy, a mixture of damp earth, rotting refuse, and the unmistakable stench of human waste. In these early hours, the town began to stir not with the gentle, refreshing calm of a new day, but with the unsettling sounds and sights that reminded all who breathed its air of the constant danger lurking in their midst. Open sewers ran alongside, the streets channels of dark, foul water filled with discarded waste from the homes above. The sharp, sour smell of this filth mingled with the rank odor of garbage piles left to rot in the corners where market stalls would soon be set up. Rats scurried in and out of holes, their beady eyes reflecting the faint light as they hunted for scraps, and their sharp claws scraped noisily against the stone. The chirping of flies buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of decay and disease. The streets themselves were crowded, cramped, and poorly maintained. Wooden carts creaked on their worn wheels, bumping unevenly over stones slick with mud and waste. Vendors began setting up their stalls, their voices rough and urgent as they hawked their wares: spoiled vegetables, stale bread, and salted meat whose freshness was questionable at best. The clatter of pots and pans echoed from the taverns and homes, mixing with the distant bleating of sheep and the calls of roosters. Sanitation was nearly not. Chamber pots emptied from upper windows spilled their contents onto the streets below, creating treacherous puddles and spreading filth. The combination of human and animal waste made the ground slick and treacherous, a breeding ground for germs and pests. As dawn broke further, the heat of the rising sun mingled with the smells, intensifying the foulness and causing swarms of flies to gather in thick clouds. These harsh conditions meant that even the act of simply walking through the town was a test of survival. Every breath drawn in risked inhaling disease-carrying pathogens carried on the stench and flies. The ever-present threat of infection from contaminated water and waste was a shadow that darkened every day of medieval life. The lack of proper drainage and clean water meant that diseases could spread rapidly, turning minor injuries or illnesses into fatal conditions. For those who lived in this unforgiving environment, survival depended on constant vigilance and luck. The early morning hours brought no relief, but instead revealed a world where danger was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. In this place, from the moment the sun rose, the struggle to stay alive began anew. As the morning light grew stronger, the sounds of the town intensified, filling the narrow alleys with a cacophony that was as unsettling as it was lively. The clamor of merchants setting up their stalls mingled with the distant tolling of church bells, creating a backdrop to the daily struggle of survival. The cries of street vendors hawking questionable goods echoed off the timber-framed houses, their voices sharp and insistent, each trying to outdo the other in a desperate bid to attract customers. Beneath the surface of this bustling activity lay a constant threat. The crowded streets were narrow and twisted, making escape from danger difficult. Travelers unfamiliar with the maze-like layout could easily become lost, vulnerable to pickpockets, thieves, or worse. The wooden structures lining the streets were packed tightly together, with overhanging upper stories that blocked much of the sunlight, casting deep shadows and fostering dampness and decay. These conditions created an ideal environment for vermin and disease to thrive, making every corner of the town a potential hazard. Open gutters and stagnant pools collected rainwater, mixed with refuse, creating breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other insects. The persistent hum of flies was not just an annoyance, but a reminder of the filth that permeated every aspect of medieval urban life. These insects were carriers of disease, responsible for spreading illnesses such as typhus and dysentery, which could sweep through the population with devastating speed. The people themselves bore the marks of their environment. Faces were often grimy, clothes worn and patched, and bodies thin from malnutrition and illness. The lack of personal hygiene facilities meant that bathing was a rare luxury, and the smell of unwashed bodies mingled with the odors of the streets. The poor and destitute were particularly vulnerable, living in cramped quarters with little ventilation, where sickness could spread unchecked. As the townsfolk moved through their morning routines, carrying water, tending animals, preparing food, they were constantly navigating these dangers. Children played amidst the refuse, unaware of the invisible threats around them, while adults went about their business with a wary eye on their surroundings. The early hours of the day were fraught with peril. From the moment one stepped outside, the relative safety of home, the sensory assault of the medieval town at dawn was overwhelming. The sights of grime and decay, the smells of rot and waste, the sounds of bustling but dangerous streets, these were not merely discomforts but clear and present dangers that could claim lives with little warning. For anyone unprepared for the harsh realities of this world, surviving even a single day posed a monumental challenge. The threat of disease lingered invisibly in the air, carried on the breath of every passerby and in the dirt beneath their feet. Small cuts or abrasions, common in such a harsh environment, could quickly become infected, leading to agonizing illness or death. The townsfolk's limited medical knowledge offered little defense against the invisible enemies thriving in filth and decay. Animals roamed freely through the streets, pigs, goats, and chickens foraging in the refuse. Their presence contributed to the squalor, but also brought the risk of zoonotic diseases, illnesses that jumped from animals to humans. The cacophony of clucking, grunting, and bleating blended with the human noise, creating a chaotic symphony that underscored the precariousness of medieval life. The marketplace, central to the town's economy, was a hive of activity and risk. Vendors sold goods that varied wildly in quality and safety. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, food spoiled quickly, attracting insects and rodents. Shoppers had to be cautious, wary of consuming tainted meat or moldy bread. Hunger often pushed people to take dangerous chances, exacerbating the cycle of illness. Water sources were equally fraught with danger. Wells and rivers were commonly contaminated, and waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery thrived in such conditions. People drank what they could, sometimes filtered through cloth or boiled, if the knowledge and fuel were available. But many suffered the consequences of contaminated water. The noise of carts and animals, blended with the sounds of hammering and sawing from nearby workshops and construction sites, where workers faced their own daily dangers. The risk of injury was high, and without effective medical treatment, even minor wounds could become life-threatening. Throughout the dawn hours, these hazards compounded, making the medieval environment a hostile place where survival was uncertain. From the moment the town awakened, every step carried risk, every breath might draw in danger. The harsh realities of this world served as a relentless reminder that life in the Middle Ages was precarious and unforgiving. As the morning progressed, the town's inhabitants faced the constant challenge of avoiding injury and illness in their daily routines. The rough cobblestones were uneven and slippery with mud and waste, making every step a potential hazard. People carried heavy loads of firewood, water, or goods, their hands raw and blistered, their bodies weary from the physical strain of survival. Children, unaware of the dangers that surrounded them, played amidst the filth and debris. Their laughter was a brief, fragile relief from the grim realities of medieval life. Yet even their innocence could not shield them from the diseases and accidents that lurked unseen. Many would fall ill or suffer injuries that could not be properly treated, leaving families to cope with loss and hardship. Animals, often living in close quarters with humans, contributed to the spread of parasites and infection. Fleas, lice, and ticks were common, their bites causing discomfort and sometimes transmitting serious diseases. The itching and sores left behind were constant reminders of the unclean environment. Waste disposal was a perpetual problem. Without organized sewage systems, refuse piled up in the streets and alleyways. Night soil collectors attempted to clear some of the burden, but their work was limited and often dangerous. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human excrement, rotting food, and animal waste that permeated the air and clung to clothing and skin. Even the air itself seemed heavy and toxic, thick with smoke from hearth fires and burning refuse. Respiratory ailments were common, with chronic coughs and lung diseases affecting many. The lack of fresh air and sunlight in the crowded, narrow streets exacerbated these conditions. Amid this grim reality, the dawn of a new day was not a hopeful beginning but a reminder of the relentless hazards that awaited. The medieval environment was a world where danger was woven into every aspect of life, where survival required constant vigilance and endurance. The early morning hours also revealed the stark social divisions that shaped medieval towns. The wealthy lived in sturdier, better-maintained houses, often with rudimentary attempts at sanitation, while the poor crowded into dilapidated dwellings, barely protected from the elements and filth. This disparity meant that survival odds varied, widely depending on one's status, with the poorest facing the harshest risks and fewest resources to combat them. Markets bustled with merchants who often prioritized profit over quality or safety, selling goods that might be spoiled or adulterated. The risks of food poisoning and malnutrition were ever-present threats, especially for those unable to afford fresh, wholesome food. Noise and chaos filled the streets, barking dogs, shouting vendors, clattering carts, creating a stressful environment that left little room for rest or peace. At every turn, the medieval townsfolk had to negotiate a landscape fraught with dangers, disease, crime, environmental hazards, and social pressures. The cacophony and squalor were not just discomforts, but constant threats to life itself. In this unforgiving world, surviving even 24 hours was a testament to resilience and fortune. The dawn of danger in the medieval environment set the tone for the trials of the day ahead. A world where every breath, every step, carried peril. The relentless dangers of the medieval dawn extended beyond the streets into the homes and workshops of the townspeople. Wooden beams, blackened by soot, creaked under the weight of poorly maintained roofs, threatening collapse during harsh weather. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from open hearths, lacking chimneys to direct it outside, causing eyes to sting and lungs to struggle. The flickering light of candles and oil lamps cast eerie shadows, offering little comfort against the ever-present chill and dampness. Clothing, often made from coarse wool or linen, hung heavy with moisture and dirt, providing scant protection from the cold or filth. Children, apprentices, and laborers shared cramped quarters where cleanliness was a luxury few could afford. The risk of fire was constant, with accidents often devastating entire neighborhoods. Smoke alarms and fire brigades were non-existent. A single spark could quickly consume wooden homes and stores of flammable goods. In such a volatile environment, vigilance was a necessity, yet exhaustion and overwork left many vulnerable. This fragile balance between survival and catastrophe was part of the everyday reality in medieval towns, making each new dawn a test of endurance and luck. As dawn stretched its pale fingers across the medieval town, the pervasive sense of unease never fully lifted. The environment was unforgiving, a relentless opponent that tested every breath and step of its inhabitants. The streets were narrow and labyrinthine, flanked by crooked timber houses whose sagging upper floors nearly touched, creating tunnels of shadow that seemed to swallow the feeble morning light. These alleys offered little refuge from the stench of decay and the ever-present threat of danger lurking just beyond the flickering torchlight. The smell of stagnant water mixed with refuse clung stubbornly to every surface, saturating the fabric of daily life with an oppressive heavines. The chaotic sounds of awakening townsfolk pierced the morning air. Vendors, some coughing and hacking, from years of inhaling smoke and dust, shouted their wares with hoarse voices, while animal pigs rooting through discarded scraps, dogs barking at unseen threats, added to the cacophony. The clatter of wooden wheels on uneven stones was punctuated by the cries of children, whose laughter seemed almost out of place in this grim setting. Yet, even their innocent play was overshadowed by the visible grime covering their clothes and faces, and the invisible risks threatening their fragile lives. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Open cesspits and gutters clogged with waste formed stagnant pools teeming with disease vectors. It was common for residents to dispose of their chamber pots directly onto the streets below their windows, where the contents mingled with mud and animal droppings. This mixture fostered the rapid growth of bacteria and parasites. Flies buzzed incessantly, swarming the heaps of rotting garbage that accumulated in corners, attracted by the sickly sweet odor of decomposition. Rats plump and brazen scurried through these refuse piles and dark corners, their piercing eyes gleaming as they hunted for morsels, often oblivious to the danger they posed as carriers of deadly plague. The risk of infection from this filthy environment was compounded by the close quarters in which people lived. Entire families might share a single room with little ventilation, where dampness seeped through cracked wooden walls and mold flourished. The cold, especially in autumn and winter, was brutal and unrelenting. People wore layers of heavy, coarse fabrics that could never fully block the chill, and their bodies bore the marks of constant exposure to the elements and hard labor. Even simple activities like drawing water from the well or carrying firewood became fraught with physical peril. Water itself was a source of fear. Wells, often shallow and uncovered, could be contaminated by surface runoff carrying human and animal waste. Drinking this water was a gamble that many had no choice but to take. The consequences were dire cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses spread rapidly, decimating populations in waves. The inability to boil or purify water due to scarce fuel and lack of knowledge only worsened the problem. Infected water and poor hygiene were invisible killers that stalked every household. The mental toll of this harsh environment was immense. People lived with constant anxiety, worried about illness, injury, and violence. Crime was rampant. The crowded and dimly lit streets made pickpocketing, assault, and robbery common threats. Travelers risked losing what little possessions they carried, while townsfolk had to remain vigilant against opportunistic thieves. Justice was harsh and often arbitrary, offering little protection to the vulnerable. The fear of sudden violence hung over the community like a persistent shadow dot. In addition to these physical dangers, the social fabric was strained by poverty and rigid class structures. The wealthy might have had access to sturdier homes and marginally better sanitation, but even they could not escape the overall perilous conditions of medieval life. For the majority, the peasants, laborers, and poor urban dwellers, survival was a day-to-day battle against the environment and society itself. Hunger, exhaustion, and despair were common companions. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the toll of the morning hours was already evident. The tired faces of townspeople, the ragged clothing, and the weariness in their steps spoke to the harshness of life in the Middle Ages. Each day brought new risks. Every breath of the foul air, every contact with contaminated surfaces, and every interaction with potentially hostile neighbors was a gamble with survival. Even the simple act of seeking warmth was complicated by the ever-present danger of fire. Hearths were central to homes and communal spaces, providing much-needed heat and a place to cook meager meals. However, these open flames were constant sources of risk. Fire could spread rapidly in the densely packed wooden buildings, and there were no organized firefighting efforts to control outbreaks. Families lived with the knowledge that a single accident could destroy their home and possessions, forcing them into even greater hardship. The medieval town at dawn was a world where every moment was tinged with danger and uncertainty. The environment itself seemed hostile, filled with invisible threats that lurked in the air, water, and earth. Survival demanded resilience, vigilance, and a degree of fortune that often felt out of reach. In this unforgiving setting, even the first 24 hours were a brutal test of human endurance. The constant presence of danger shaped not only the physical surroundings, but also the mindset of medieval inhabitants. From the moment they awoke, a pervasive sense of vulnerability permeated their thoughts. The knowledge that illness could strike suddenly, that injury might become fatal without proper care, and that violence could erupt without warning, instilled a wary caution in every action. This was a world where hope was tempered by fear, and every step outside the relative safety of one's home was a gamble. Noise and chaos filled the air, yet amid the tumult, moments of eerie stillness surfaced. Silent streets where only the buzz of flies disturbed the oppressive quiet. The scent of decay was never far away, lingering in doorways and narrow alleys, clinging to clothing and skin. It was a smell that no amount of washing could entirely erase, a reminder of the fragile barrier between life and death. Children were especially vulnerable in this environment. With limited understanding and few means of protection, they played amidst the filth and danger. Many did not survive past early childhood, succumbing to disease or accident. The grief of such losses was a heavy burden borne silently by families already struggling to survive, yet life pressed on. The cyclical nature of birth and death underscored the harsh realities of medieval existence. Trade and travel brought additional risks. Merchants and travelers who passed through the town risked exposure to unfamiliar diseases and hostile strangers. The lack of regulated sanitation along roads and inns meant that contamination spread quickly. The constant movement of people and goods was both vital and perilous, contributing to the rapid transmission of illness and the potential for conflict. Throughout the day, the relentless cycle of labor, risk, and survival continued. People worked long hours in difficult conditions, farmers tending fields prone to drought or flood, blacksmiths working near roaring fires with heavy tools, and merchants navigating the treacherous dynamics of the market. Injuries were common, and the absence of effective medical care made even minor wounds dangerous. Infection and gangrene often followed, turning small accidents into deadly threats. Religious faith provided some comfort amidst these hardships. Many turned to prayer and ritual for protection, hoping for divine intervention against the invisible enemies of disease and misfortune. Pilgrimages, church attendance, and participation in festivals were not only spiritual acts, but also social gatherings that fostered community support. However, superstition and fear sometimes led to scapegoating and persecution, adding psychological stress to physical suffering. As dusk approached, the dangers of the medieval town shifted but did not diminish. Darkness brought new threats: poor visibility, increased crime, and the risk of fire spreading unchecked. People hurried indoors, seeking the safety of their homes. Though these were often cramped and cold, the comfort of the hearth offered warmth but little protection from the perils outside or the illnesses within. Surviving 24 hours in this environment required more than physical strength. It demanded constant vigilance, resilience, and a measure of luck. The medieval world was a crucible of hardship, where the line between life and death was thin and constantly tested. From the foul air to the crowded streets, from the threat of disease to the dangers of violence, every moment was a battle to endure. The struggle to find enough food was a daily reality for most people living in the Middle Ages. Unlike the abundance many experience today, medieval diets were often meager, repetitive, and fraught with danger. Scarcity was a persistent shadow, lurking behind every meal, threatening to steal the strength needed for survival. Markets were patchy and unreliable, fields vulnerable to weather and pests, and food storage was primitive, making spoilage a constant threat. The typical diet of a medieval peasant centered on simple, readily available staples: coarse bread baked from rye or barley, porridge made from oats, and seasonal vegetables like cabbage and onions. Meat was a luxury, consumed rarely and often reserved for special occasions. When available, it was usually salted or smoked to preserve it, but even then, its quality was questionable. Fish, especially salted or dried, was more common in coastal regions, but freshness was never guaranteed. Preservation methods were rudimentary. Drying, salting, smoking, and pickling were the main ways to extend the shelf life of food. However, these methods often altered the taste, texture, and smell of the food in ways that could be unappetizing or even dangerous if done improperly. Salted meats could be tough and salty to the point of dehydration. Dried fish, brittle and pungent. Pickled vegetables sometimes fermented too far, developing off-putting odors and flavors. Improperly stored grains were vulnerable to mold and infestation by weevils, turning a vital food source into a hazard. Food spoilage was more than an inconvenience, it was a serious health risk. Without refrigeration, bacteria and fungi could multiply rapidly in stored food, leading to contamination. Consuming spoiled food often resulted in food poisoning, with symptoms ranging from nausea and vomiting to severe dehydration and death. The risk was compounded by the lack of medical knowledge and effective treatments. Even fresh food was not always safe. Contamination from poor sanitation or polluted water sources could introduce harmful pathogens. Medieval cooks had to be inventive, using herbs and spices not only to flavor their meals but also in hopes of masking unpleasant tastes or reducing illness. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar were common, their strong aromas often overpowering the natural flavor of the food. Despite these efforts, the scent of meals often betrayed the underlying decay. A sour temps, a musty odor, or an acrid smoke hung in the air, warning of potential danger. The sensory experience of eating in the Middle Ages was a mix of survival and suspicion. The sight of worms or maggots in stored grain was not uncommon, and such infestations could spread quickly, ruining entire supplies. The texture of stale bread was hard and crumbly, sometimes soaked in broth to make it more palatable. Meat could be tough or slimy, and fish carried a strong, fishy odor that lingered long after the meal ended. Markets were bustling yet hazardous places. Food was often sold uncovered, exposed to flies, dust, and the elements. Vendors had little incentive to maintain cleanliness. Their priority was selling whatever they could, regardless of quality. Shoppers had to judge carefully, relying on sight and smell to avoid spoiled goods. However, hunger frequently outweighed caution, forcing many to take risks with questionable food. Food scarcity was cyclical, tied closely to the agricultural calendar and harvest yields. In times of drought, flood, or poor harvests, starvation became widespread. Famine outbreaks were devastating, reducing populations and weakening communities. During these periods, the quality and quantity of food diminished drastically, increasing reliance on preserved but potentially unsafe foods. The psychological toll of hunger was immense. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach was a constant companion, sapping energy and focus. Weakness from malnutrition left individuals vulnerable to disease and injury. Parents struggled to feed their children, often sacrificing their own share. The fear of hunger drove people to desperate measures, including theft or selling possessions to buy food. In noble households, diets were somewhat more varied, with access to fresh meat, fruits and spices imported from distant lands. However, even among the wealthy, concerns about food safety and preservation persisted. Feasts could be lavish, but the risk of foodborne illness was ever present. Medieval cooks used boiling and roasting techniques to prepare meals, which could help kill some pathogens, but the effectiveness varied. Open fires and rudimentary ovens made consistent cooking difficult, and undercooked food remained a hazard. The smoky kitchens filled with the aroma of burning wood and charred meat were scenes of hard labor and constant vigilance. For many, the act of eating was inseparable from the struggle to stay alive. Each meal carried the hope of nourishment and the risk of harm. The sensory world of medieval food, the sights, smells, textures, and tastes painted a vivid picture of life's fragility and the constant negotiation between survival and peril. Early morning markets were crowded, noisy, and chaotic places where the struggle for sustenance was most visible. Vendors shouted their wares, from baskets of bruised and overripe fruits to salted fish that reeked of brine and decay. The air was thick with a mixture of enticing spices and unpleasant odors, a constant reminder of the thin line between nourishment and poison. Buyers moved cautiously, inspecting their purchases carefully, knowing that a bad decision could lead to days of illness. Preserved foods, though invaluable, often carried hidden dangers. Salted meats, a common staple, could be tainted with harmful bacteria if the salting process was inadequate or if storage conditions were poor. Smokehouses, while adding flavor and preservation, sometimes allowed molds to grow, producing toxins invisible to the naked eye. Drying food under open skies exposed it to insects and dust, which contaminated the products further. These preservation techniques, born of necessity, were imperfect shields against the ravages of time and nature. The medieval kitchen was a place of both resourcefulness and risk. Cooking was done over open flames or in rudimentary ovens, where controlling temperature was difficult. The thick smoke and heat filled cramped spaces, making the work exhausting and hazardous. The constant need to scavenge for fuel added to the labor. Despite these challenges, cooks endeavored to make meals that were not only edible, but as palatable as possible. Mixing herbs and spices to mask off flavors and add variety, Herbs such as sage, rosemary, and thyme were prized, not just for taste but also for their perceived medicinal properties. Vinegar and mustard were used generously to preserve and flavor food, their sharp scents filling the kitchen. Yet, even these additions could not always prevent sickness. The frequent outbreaks of foodborne illness suggest that contamination was a persistent and deadly problem. Water used in cooking and drinking was often suspect, drawn from wells or rivers contaminated by waste. Boiling water was not a widespread practice, partly due to the scarcity of fuel. As a result, diseases transmitted through water were common, compounding the risks posed by unsafe food. People lived in a constant state of caution and resignation, aware that even the most basic needs could endanger their health. Hunger drove people to take desperate measures. Bread, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, was often made from coarse grains and could be stale or infested with insects. In some cases, people resorted to eating acorns, roots, or even grass during times of famine. The scarcity of fresh produce in winter months further exacerbated nutritional deficiencies, leaving populations vulnerable to scurvy and other illnesses. Children and the elderly were most at risk, their bodies less able to cope with the constant onslaught of poor nutrition and disease. Mortality rates were high, and families often buried several children in quick succession. The emotional toll of hunger and loss was profound, yet daily life continued with grim determination. Among the nobility and clergy, access to better food meant some respite from these dangers. They enjoyed richer diets, including more frequent meat and imported spices, yet even they were not immune to food spoilage and poisoning. The knowledge of food safety was limited, and many believed that illness was a punishment from the divine rather than a result of contamination. Festivals and religious observances provided occasional feasts, where food was abundant and varied. These moments were treasured breaks from the monotony and hardship of daily survival. Yet the risk of overeating or consuming unfamiliar foods could still lead to illness. The communal sharing of food reinforced social bonds but also spread disease. In this world, the act of eating was a complex negotiation between necessity and danger. The sensory experiences surrounding food, the pungent smells, the rough textures, the uncertain tastes were constant reminders of the precariousness of life. Every meal was a hope for strength and vitality, shadowed by the fear of sickness and death. The medieval diet was shaped not only by availability, but also by strict social and religious codes that influenced what and when people ate. Fasting days and feast days alternated throughout the year, dictating periods of scarcity and plenty. On fasting days, meat and dairy were forbidden, and people subsisted on vegetables, fish, or even bread and water, increasing the risk of malnutrition. During these times, the reliance on seasonal food meant that preservation was essential for survival during the long, harsh winters. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were stored in cool cellars, while salted and smoked fish provided crucial protein. But these preserved foods often carried an unpleasant odor and tough texture, making the experience of eating one of endurance as much as nourishment. In towns, the presence of guilds controlled the production and sale of food, but enforcement of quality standards was inconsistent. Consumers had little protection against spoiled or adulterated goods. Bakers might add chalk to bread to increase weight, while butchers could sell meat from animals long dead or diseased. Such practices further jeopardized health, yet were tolerated. Due to poverty and necessity, food preparation was labor-intensive and required constant attention to prevent spoilage. Smokehouses needed regular maintenance, drying racks had to be protected from rain, and salt stocks had to be carefully rationed. These efforts were vital but never guaranteed success. A sudden storm or a shortage of salt could ruin supplies, plunging families into hunger and desperation. The sensory landscape of medieval meals was complex. The sour tang of vinegar, the sharp bite of mustard, and the bitter notes of certain herbs masked the less appealing flavors of spoiled or preserved food. The sight of mold on bread or discoloration on meat might be overlooked if hunger was great enough. Eating was often a battle against instinct, driven by necessity rather than desire. For children, the experience of food was even harsher. They were given the least desirable portions and often went hungry. The texture of hard, stale bread and the strong smells of preserved fish might be their only sustenance for days. This diet led to stunted growth and weakened immunity, making them especially vulnerable to disease. Despite these challenges, medieval cooks and households exhibited remarkable ingenuity. Recipes were passed down, adapting to available ingredients and preservation methods. Fermentation, for example, was used not just to preserve, but also to create nutritious and digestible foods like sauerkraut. People learned which plants were safe to eat and how to prepare them to minimize risk. In noble households, the complexity of the diet was greater, with multiple courses and imported spices adding flavor and status. Kitchens were staffed by servants trained in various cooking techniques, yet even here the threat of food poisoning lingered. The absence of refrigeration and limited understanding of bacteria meant that illness from food was a common hazard. Regardless of social class, mealtimes were more than just eating. They were social rituals reinforcing hierarchy and community. Sharing food was an act of trust and connection. Yet the scarcity and danger surrounding food made these moments fraught with anxiety. The effort to secure safe, nourishing food was a daily struggle that shaped the medieval experience in profound ways. In the markets, the visual cues that modern shoppers rely upon, freshness, color, texture, were often unreliable indicators of food safety. Rotting fruit might appear only slightly discolored. Meat tainted with bacteria could still look deceptively fresh. Buyers relied heavily on smell, a skill honed out of necessity. The sharp, sour odor of spoiled food was a warning, but not always easy to detect in mixed crowds and bustling stalls. Even when suspicion arose, hunger often overrode caution, forcing people to consume food that might compromise their health. The consumption of spoiled or contaminated food could trigger outbreaks of foodborne illnesses, sometimes decimating entire communities. Symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and fever were common, yet little could be done to treat them beyond herbal remedies and rest. The role of herbs and natural treatments in medieval medicine was significant, but limited in effectiveness. Plants such as chamomile, mint, and willow bark were used to soothe stomach ailments or reduce fevers, yet the causes of many illnesses remained mysterious. People often attributed disease to spiritual causes, sin, or the will of higher powers, rather than contamination or bacteria. This lack of understanding compounded the dangers of food consumption, as preventive measures were minimal or misguided. Nutrition was often inadequate, with diets low in essential vitamins and minerals, leading to chronic conditions such as scurvy. The absence of fresh fruits and vegetables during winter months was particularly detrimental, weakening immune systems and increasing susceptibility to disease. Even in times of plenty, the poor quality and preservation methods meant that the risk of food poisoning remained high. In this harsh reality, the simple act of eating was a precarious balancing act between sustaining life and courting illness. The sights, smells, and tastes of medieval food paint a vivid picture of struggle, survival, and resilience in a world fraught with uncertainty. The medieval market was a sensory storm, a swirl of sights, sounds, and smells that both beckoned and warned. Vendors shouted loudly, advertising wares that ranged from fresh catches to dubious leftovers. The colors of fruits and vegetables were often muted and bruised, their textures varying from soggy to shriveled. Meat, when available, was typically salted or smoked, its texture tough and chewy, with a smell that oscillated between inviting and faintly rancid. Buyers navigated the crowded stalls with practiced caution, nostrils flaring to catch any hint of spoilage. Yet, hunger often compelled them to overlook warning signs, pushing them toward risky choices. The fine line between nourishment and poison was invisible, making every purchase a gamble with health. Food spoilage was a constant threat. Without modern refrigeration, bacteria flourished in the warm months, turning once edible food into a breeding ground for illness. Grains, a staple of the medieval diet, were vulnerable to mold, which could produce toxic substances invisible to the naked eye. Consuming moldy bread or grain could lead to severe illness or death, though people lacked the knowledge to recognize or avoid these dangers. The preservation methods, salting, smoking, drying, and pickling, were vital but imperfect. Salt could inhibit some bacterial growth but was insufficient if applied unevenly. Smoking added flavor and helped dry meat, yet cold, damp smokehouses often fostered mold growth instead. Drying foods exposed them to insects and dust, contaminating the product further. Cooking was no simple remedy. Fire was essential to preparing meals, but controlling temperature was difficult, and undercooked food remained a hazard. Kitchens were smoky, cramped, and filled with the pungent aroma of burning wood and herbs, often making it hard to discern the true scent of food. Spices and herbs played a crucial role, masking unpleasant tastes and, it was hoped, combating illness. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar were common additions, their strong aromas blending with the smoky air. Though their antiseptic qualities are now known, medieval people mainly used these flavors for culinary enhancement and superstition. The taste of food often reflected necessity over pleasure, with meals being salty, sour, or bitter, depending on preservation techniques and available ingredients. Water was another silent danger. Sourced from wells, rivers, or rain barrels, it was frequently contaminated by animal waste and human sewage. Boiling water to purify it was rare, hindered by the scarcity of fuel and limited understanding of germ theory. As a result, waterborne illnesses like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were rampant, devastating populations during outbreaks. The combination of tainted food and water created a deadly synergy, turning common meals into potential death traps. Villagers understood this risk only through painful experience, often associating illness with divine punishment rather than contamination. Nutrition suffered deeply due to these conditions. The medieval diet lacked variety and essential nutrients, particularly vitamins C and D. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, largely absent during winter months. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies led to diseases like scurvy, causing weakness, swollen gums, and poor wound healing. Children were especially vulnerable, their growth stunted by repeated bouts of hunger and illness. This chronic malnourishment left communities fragile, with lowered resistance to infections and slow recovery from injuries. Despite scarcity, medieval cooks and housewives were resourceful. They experimented with fermentation and pickling to stretch food supplies and enhance nutrition. Sauerkraut and pickled root vegetables provided some vitamin C during lean months. Small-scale farming and foraging supplemented diets with wild herbs, berries, and nuts. Though these were unpredictable sources, bread, the dietary cornerstone, was often made from coarse grains mixed with cheaper fillers like bran or even ground acorns. Though nutritionally poor, bread was filling and indispensable. The social implications of food scarcity were profound. Wealthier households enjoyed more abundant and diverse diets, with access to fresh meat, dairy, and imported spices. Their kitchens bustled with servants skilled in culinary arts, preparing feasts that showcased status and hospitality. Yet even these privileged meals were not free from the risks of spoilage and contamination. The poor, however, faced daily hunger and monotonous diets, making survival a constant challenge. Starvation was common during famines caused by crop failures, war, or natural disasters, leading to social unrest and population decline. Hunger influenced behavior deeply. It fostered competition and desperation, sometimes driving people to steal or sell possessions to buy food. Communities organized charity during hard times, but resources were limited and aid often insufficient. The psychological strain of persistent hunger bred despair, shaping attitudes and cultural norms around food and survival. Medieval feasts, though rare, were moments of joy and relief. They featured richly spiced meats, sweet pastries, and abundant drink, celebrated with music and dance. Yet even during these gatherings, the shadow of foodborne illness loomed. Without knowledge of proper food handling, large meals could become breeding grounds for disease, endangering guests. In sum, medieval food scarcity and safety issues were inextricably linked to the harshness of the era. The sensory landscape of food, from the sight of moldy bread to the bitter taste of salted meat, painted a vivid portrait of human endurance. Each meal was a cautious act, a balancing of hunger and health, comfort and risk. Understanding this struggle offers profound insight into the realities faced by our ancestors and the fragility of life in the Middle Ages. The experience of eating, in the Middle Ages was also shaped by the communal nature of meals. Most people ate in shared spaces, whether within the cramped family quarters or the bustling taverns that served as social hubs. Food was often placed on common wooden platters, and individuals ate with their hands or shared simple utensils. This close contact increased the risk of spreading illness, especially in a time before germ theory or effective hygiene practices. Despite the dangers, sharing food was an important social ritual. It reinforced bonds, established trust, and maintained a sense of community amid hardship. People took comfort in these shared moments, finding brief reprieve from the daily struggles of survival. However, the quality and safety of food remained a constant concern, and many meals were taken with a wary mind. The role of women in food preparation was crucial. They managed the household stores, oversaw preservation methods, and prepared meals under difficult conditions. Their knowledge of herbs, fermentation, and cooking techniques was passed down through generations, serving as vital tools for survival. Yet, even their skill could not always prevent illness or malnutrition in the family. Children's diets were especially fragile. Often given the least desirable scraps, they suffered greatly from food shortages and poor nutrition. Malnourishment weakened their developing bodies, making them susceptible to common diseases and infections. High child mortality rates were a tragic reality of medieval life, a harsh reminder of the dangers hidden in every meal. The seasonal rhythm dictated food availability. Winters were particularly harsh, with fresh food scarce and preservation methods pushed to their limits. Communities relied heavily on stored grains, salted meats, and root vegetables, which, while essential, often lacked the nutrients needed for long-term health. Spring brought relief with the return of fresh produce, but the cycle of scarcity and abundance weighed heavily on the population's well-being. Religious practices also influenced food consumption. Numerous fasting days imposed restrictions on meat and dairy intake, limiting the diet further. These observances were both spiritual exercises and reflections of seasonal food scarcity. While providing structure, they sometimes exacerbated nutritional deficits, especially during extended periods of fasting. The psychological impact of hunger and food insecurity was profound. Constant worry over the next meal, coupled with the physical effects of malnutrition, shaped the mental landscape of medieval society. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, communities persevered. Shared knowledge, resourcefulness, and cultural rituals around food offered resilience and hope. In examining the sights, smells, and tastes of medieval food, one gains a deeper appreciation for the courage required to face each day. The struggle to eat safely was not merely a matter of sustenance, but a continual battle against a world filled with unseen threats. The sensory experiences surrounding food, often harsh and unappealing, were woven into the very fabric of medieval survival. The medieval world was shadowed not only by visible hardships, but by invisible killers that stalked the crowded streets, dark alleys, and humble homes. Diseases such as the plague, tuberculosis, and dysentery were relentless enemies, spreading swiftly and mercilessly through towns where people lived in close quarters and sanitation was nearly non-existent. The very air seemed to carry whispers of death, as coughing echoed from doorways, and the persistent buzzing of flies marked the presence of decay. Rats were everywhere, scuttling beneath market stalls, slipping through cracks in wooden buildings, and nesting in refuse heaps. Their dark, beady eyes gleamed in the dim light as they foraged for food, oblivious to the havoc they wreaked by carrying fleas infected with the deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria. The plague, known as the Black Death in later centuries, was responsible for some of the most devastating epidemics in history, wiping out vast swathes of populations in a terrifyingly short span of time. Flies thrived on the filth and rot that permeated medieval towns. Their incessant buzzing was more than an annoyance. They were vectors for disease, spreading infections by landing on wounds, food, and open sores. The sight of maggots writhing in decaying matter was common, a grotesque reminder of nature's cycles and the ever-present threat of contamination. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, crept silently through communities. Its sufferers were marked by persistent coughing, fatigue, and wasting away. The sound of coughing fits echoed through homes and streets, a haunting symptom of a disease that was poorly understood and untreatable with the medical knowledge of the time. Those afflicted were often shunned, isolated by fear and superstition, left to suffer in solitude. Dysentery, a disease caused by contaminated water and poor hygiene, ravaged medieval towns with brutal efficiency. Its symptoms, severe diarrhea, dehydration, and fever, quickly debilitated victims, often leading to death, especially among the young and elderly. The smell of illness hung heavily in the air around afflicted households, mingling with the stench of waste and decay. The medieval medical system was rudimentary at best. Physicians and healers operated with limited understanding of disease causes, often attributing illnesses to divine punishment, imbalances of bodily humors, or evil spirits. Treatments were largely ineffective, relying on herbal remedies, bloodletting, or prayers. Hospitals, where they existed, were places of charity rather than healing, overcrowded and unsanitary. Psychologically, the omnipresence of disease instilled a deep sense of fear and helplessness. Communities were gripped by dread during outbreaks, with funerals becoming daily occurrences, the sound of church bells tolling to mark the dead mixed with the groans of the sick, creating an atmosphere thick with grief and terror. People lived in constant anxiety, wary of touching others or sharing spaces, yet powerless to prevent the spread. Families watched helplessly as loved ones weakened and died, often without comfort or care. Burial practices were hurried and minimal, with mass graves commandeering severe epidemics. The rituals of mourning were disrupted, compounding the emotional trauma. Survivors were haunted by loss, guilt, and the uncertainty of their own fate. Socially, disease outbreaks could unravel the fabric of communities. Labor shortages from high mortality rates caused economic disruption. Fear bred mistrust and scapegoating. Marginalized groups, including foreigners or the poor, were often blamed for spreading illness. Witch hunts and accusations became tragically common. Fueled by desperation and ignorance, the sights and sounds of pestilence permeated every aspect of medieval life. The sight of blackened buboes, the thick smoke from burning infected homes, the cries of the dying, these images became etched into the collective memory of populations. The relentless advance of disease-shaped cultural attitudes towards death, faith, and the human body. Despite the overwhelming devastation, medieval people sought meaning and hope. Religious faith provided comfort. Prayers and pilgrimages were believed to offer protection and healing. Communities gathered for rituals meant to ward off evil, even as they faced the harsh realities of loss and suffering. This pervasive presence of invisible killers created a world where survival was uncertain, and every breath was fraught with risk. The psychological weight of living under such threat shaped behaviors, relationships, and social structures in profound ways. The medieval town was not just a physical environment of filth and poverty, but a landscape haunted by the specter of death, demanding resilience and courage from all who dwelt within. The relentless spread of disease in medieval towns was fueled by the very conditions that defined daily life: overcrowding, poor hygiene, and inadequate waste disposal. Houses were packed tightly together, with narrow streets funneling people into close proximity. This lack of space meant that infections could travel swiftly from one person to the next. Windows were small and often sealed shut against the cold, limiting ventilation and trapping stale, contaminated air inside homes. The dampness that seeped into walls and floors encouraged mold growth and respiratory illnesses, compounding the risk. The sounds of suffering were ever present. Harsh coughs rattled from the lungs of the sick, sometimes echoing through the empty streets at night. Moans of pain and despair floated from infirmaries and private homes alike. The tolling of church bells marked the passage of the dead, their somber peals a grim soundtrack to the unending cycle of illness and death. People tried to carry on despite the fear, but the psychological strain was heavy. Constant dread wore down even the strongest spirits. Rats, silent and unseen in the shadows, were notorious for their role in disease transmission. Fleas that lived on these rodents were carriers of the deadly plague bacterium, spreading the Black Death that would later devastate Europe. These small creatures multiplied rapidly in the filth, oblivious to the havoc they wrought. Attempts to control their numbers were futile in such unhygienic times, and townsfolk lived in perpetual vulnerability. Flies buzzed relentlessly, drawn to open sores, spoiled food, and stagnant water. Their presence was more than a nuisance. They were a crucial vector in the spread of illness. The sight of flies landing on wounds or food caused dread, yet was unavoidable. This constant exposure heightened the risk of infections that medieval medicine was ill-equipped to treat. Hospitals, where they existed, were crowded and lacked basic cleanliness. Patients were often crammed into communal beds with little separation, facilitating the rapid spread of disease. The lack of sterilization and understanding of contagion meant that the sick were as likely to infect others as to recover. Clerics and healers offered prayers and rudimentary treatments, but the outcomes were often grim. Medical knowledge was steeped in superstition and flawed theories. The dominant belief in the imbalance of the four humors led to treatments such as bloodletting and purging, which often weakened patients further. Remedies drawn from herbs and potions varied widely in effectiveness, and many could cause more harm than good. Fear of witchcraft and divine punishment further complicated care, sometimes leading to neglect or persecution of the ill. The psychological impact of living amidst such pervasive pestilence cannot be overstated. Anxiety, grief, and a fatalistic acceptance of death shaped individual and communal attitudes. The looming presence of disease fostered suspicion and fear, fracturing social bonds and fueling scapegoating. Communities faced not only the physical toll of illness but the erosion of trust and solidarity. Despite these hardships, medieval people showed remarkable resilience. Faith, family, and community offered sources of strength. Rituals of prayer, pilgrimage, and communal support helped many cope with loss and uncertainty. Stories of healing and survival provided hope, even in the darkest times. The sights, sounds, and smells of disease-ridden towns created an atmosphere thick with tension and despair. The very environment seemed hostile, turning everyday life into a constant struggle against invisible enemies. In this world, survival was never guaranteed, and the presence of invisible killers shaped the fate of entire populations. The impact of disease extended beyond individual health to disrupt the social and economic fabric of medieval towns. High mortality rates led to labor shortages, weakening agricultural productivity and crafts. Fields went untended, workshops slowed, and the flow of goods diminished. Markets became places of uncertainty, as fear of contagion kept many from gathering, further strangling economic life. Families were torn apart, and social hierarchies were shaken as entire generations vanished in the wake of epidemics. In the face of such devastation, communities developed coping mechanisms. Quarantines were sometimes imposed, with infected individuals isolated to prevent spread, though enforcement was inconsistent and often met with resistance. Burial practices adapted to cope with the volume of dead, with mass graves becoming common during severe outbreaks. The psychological scars of these experiences left deep impressions on the collective consciousness, influencing art, literature, and religious thought. The pervasive fear of illness and death also fueled superstitions and rituals aimed at protection. Amulets, charms, and prayers were believed to shield individuals from harm. Pilgrimages to holy sites offered hope for healing and divine intervention. At the same time, suspicion and scapegoating led to tragic persecutions, as marginalized groups were blamed for bringing disease. These social dynamics added layers of complexity to the already harrowing reality of medieval pestilence. Despite the overwhelming challenges, tales of resilience and survival persisted. Individuals and families found ways to support one another, drawing on faith, community ties, and personal strength. The human spirit, though battered, endured. These stories of endurance provide valuable insight into the lived experience of the Middle Ages, revealing a society constantly grappling with the invisible forces that shaped their world. The sensory details of medieval pestilence, the sight of swollen buboes, the sound of labored breathing, the relentless hum of flies remain haunting reminders of a time when disease was a constant companion. Understanding this environment helps modern audiences appreciate the fragility of life and the resilience required to face daily dangers that were beyond sight but ever-present. The relentless advance of diseases shaped not only individual lives, but also the cultural and spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. People sought meaning in suffering, turning to faith for comfort and explanation. Churches became centers of solace, where masses were held to pray for the sick and departed. The interplay between hope and despair was palpable. Hymns of mercy echoed alongside the sobbing of mourners. Religious imagery, depicting saints and martyrs, provided models of endurance and salvation amidst widespread mortality. Art and literature of the period reflect the omnipresence of death and disease. Memento mori, themes reminders of mortality were common, encouraging the living to reflect on the transient nature of life. These cultural expressions underscored the psychological impact of pestilence, embedding it deeply into the medieval worldview. Medical practitioners, though limited by the era's knowledge, played a crucial role in caring for the afflicted. Barber surgeons, apothecaries, and herbalists used available remedies with varying degrees of success. Herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and purgatives were common treatments, often guided by trial, tradition, and superstition. Despite their efforts, the lack of understanding of contagion meant that many interventions inadvertently facilitated the spread of disease. Public health measures were rudimentary. Attempts at quarantine and isolation were inconsistent and sometimes resisted due to economic pressures and social distrust. Sanitation efforts were minimal, hindered by the lack of infrastructure and understanding. Towns struggled to manage waste, clean water supplies, and overcrowding, creating fertile grounds for ongoing outbreaks. The social fabric was tested by these crises. Families mourned lost members while grappling with the practical challenges of survival. Communities banded together for mutual support, but fear and suspicion could also breed conflict and division. The psychological burden of living in a world shadowed by invisible killers shaped the behaviors, beliefs, and customs of medieval society. The sensory world of medieval pestilence was stark and overwhelming. The sight of mass graves, the sound of coughing and weeping, the smell of decay, these were constant reminders of mortality. Yet amid this grim reality, human resilience shone through. People adapted, sought comfort, and found meaning, forging a legacy of endurance that echoes through history. The legacy of disease and pestilence in the Middle Ages also influenced the development of early public health practices. Cities began to recognize the importance of cleanliness, even if the underlying reasons were not fully understood. Ordinances were enacted to regulate waste disposal, prevent overcrowding, and control the movement of potentially infected individuals. Though these measures were limited and often poorly enforced, they marked the beginning of communal efforts to combat invisible threats. Quarantine stations, or lazarettos, were established in some port cities to isolate incoming travelers suspected of carrying contagious diseases. These early attempts at containment reflected a growing awareness of contagion, even if the mechanisms remained mysterious. The fear and stigma surrounding disease shaped social interactions, altering trade, travel, and daily life. In rural areas, the impact of disease was equally profound but less documented. Small villages faced outbreaks with fewer resources and limited access to care. The isolation of these communities sometimes delayed the spread, but when illness arrived, the consequences were devastating. Folk medicine, relying on local herbs and traditional knowledge, became the primary means of treatment, blending practical remedies with spiritual rituals. The psychological toll of pestilence affected all levels of society. Fear of the unknown, the sudden loss of loved ones, and the uncertainty of survival fostered anxiety and despair. Yet, the human capacity for hope persisted. Communities gathered to pray, mourn, and support one another, strengthening social bonds in the face of adversity. The sounds of medieval pestilence, the tolling bells, the whispers of prayers, the cries of the sick formed a haunting soundtrack to daily life. These sensory experiences imprinted deeply on the collective memory, shaping cultural attitudes toward health, mortality, and faith. Through understanding the prevalence and impact of disease and pestilence, modern audiences can better appreciate the resilience and ingenuity of medieval societies. Despite living in a world dominated by invisible killers, people adapted, persevered, and laid foundations for the public health advancements that would come centuries later. The medieval streets were far from the safe thoroughfares of modern cities. Instead, they were battlegrounds where danger lurked in shadows, and survival depended as much on caution as on courage. Crime was woven into the fabric of everyday life, shaping the rhythms of the town and countryside alike. As dawn faded into dusk, the threat of robbery, assault, and even murder cast a persistent pall over the people who walked those cobbled paths. The narrow alleys and cramped market squares provided ample hiding places for thieves and cutthroats. The clatter of footsteps echoed unevenly on stone, as wary townsfolk hurried to and fro, their eyes scanning for suspicious figures. Murmurs of warnings passed between neighbors, tales of recent muggings or violent quarrels serving as grim reminders of the dangers that were waited around every corner. The sounds of conflict were harsh and sudden: a shout, the clash of wooden clubs, or iron blades, the sharp cry of a victim. Public beatings and executions were common spectacles, meant both to punish wrongdoers and to deter others. The clang of the town crier's bell summoned crowds to witness these brutal events, the atmosphere thick with tension and morbid fascination. Bandits and highwaymen were a constant menace outside city walls. Travelers journeying between towns risked ambushes along dark forest paths or lonely country roads. The hoot of an owl or the snap of a twig could signal the approach of danger. Rustling bushes concealed eyes watching for vulnerable prey. Victims faced demands for coin or goods, and refusal could lead to violence or worse. Stories of travelers, robbed and left for dead, circulated widely, adding to the fear that gripped those who dared to venture beyond familiar grounds. Inside towns, petty theft was rampant. Pickpockets plied their trade in crowded markets, deft fingers slipping purses from belts and pockets. Con artists and swindlers sought to exploit the trust and desperation of their neighbors, selling counterfeit goods or false promises. The law was harsh but unevenly applied, and many victims had little recourse to justice. Local militias and watchmen patrolled the streets, but their presence was often inadequate. Corruption and limited resources hampered law enforcement. Bribery and favoritism allowed some criminals to operate with impunity, further eroding trust within the community. People learned to protect themselves through vigilance and alliances, often traveling in groups or avoiding dangerous areas after dark. Violence was not always criminal, but also a tool of social control and justice. Feuds between families or guilds could erupt into brawls, sometimes lasting for years. Disputes over land, honor, or debt were settled with force, with swords and clubs replacing words. These conflicts could devastate neighborhoods, forcing innocents to flee or suffer collateral damage. Historical records recount harrowing episodes of street violence. One such example is the 14th century city of London, where gangs known as the Peascod Brotherhood terrorized parts of the city with extortion and robbery. Their presence created no-go zones for ordinary citizens, illustrating the limits of medieval law and order. Similarly, chroniclers described the rout as mercenary bands whose loyalty to money rather than law made them feared across the French countryside during the 100 Years' War. Fear of crime shaped daily behaviors. Merchants closed shops early, travelers avoided roads after sunset, and families barred their doors tightly at night. Trust was a scarce commodity, and suspicion colored interactions. Even within communities, accusations of theft or betrayal could ignite tensions and violence. Women were particularly vulnerable in this environment. Alone, they faced heightened risks of assault and exploitation. Many relied on protective networks of family and neighbors, while some sought refuge in convents or charitable institutions. The precariousness of their position underscored the brutal realities of medieval life. Despite these dangers, life continued. Markets thrived, festivals drew crowds, and neighborhoods bustled with activity. People adapted, developing codes of conduct and informal justice systems to navigate the complexities of their world. Honor and reputation held significant weight, serving as shields against violence or tools for negotiation. In this harsh landscape, survival demanded awareness, resilience, and often a willingness to fight. The sights and sounds of medieval crime, and violent sharp voices, clashing weapons, hurried footsteps, formed an ever-present soundtrack to daily existence. The physical scars and psychological toll left deep impressions on those who lived through these perilous times. The ever-present threat of violence forced townsfolk to develop a keen sense of awareness. Mothers kept their children close, and merchants trusted only familiar faces. Nightfall was especially dangerous. Shadows lengthened, and the bustling streets gave way to silence, pierced by distant howls or the sudden clatter of hurried footsteps. Lanterns flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, offering little comfort. Few dared to travel alone after dusk, and taverns became crowded refuges where groups gathered for safety and camaraderie. In rural areas, banditry was often brutal and unrelenting. Forest paths and trade routes were lined with the remains of those who fell victim to ambushes. The natural terrain, dense with trees and uneven ground, offered perfect hiding spots for armed gangs. Travelers bore the constant weight of fear, clutching their belongings tightly, their eyes darting nervously. Stories spread quickly, tales of travelers robbed of goods, horses, and sometimes their lives, served as chilling warnings. Local lords and nobles attempted to maintain order through private militias and mounted patrols, but their reach was limited. These forces were often preoccupied with larger political conflicts or personal vendettas, leaving many regions vulnerable. The law was frequently enforced selectively, favoring the powerful and wealthy, while the poor suffered unchecked violence. Justice was swift and harsh when applied, but inconsistent, breeding resentment and mistrust. Street violence extended beyond simple theft and banditry. Public punishments were common and served as grim spectacles. Floggings, hangings, and even executions by burning drew crowds, their macabre nature reinforcing social order through fear. The cries of the condemned and the murmurs of the gathered crowds became a regular part of the urban soundscape. These brutal displays were meant to deter crime but also reflected the harsh realities of medieval justice. Quarrels and feuds were an endemic part of life, often erupting into bloody confrontations. Disputes over land boundaries, debts, or perceived insults escalated rapidly, sometimes involving entire families or guilds. These conflicts could last generations, with cycles of revenge fueling ongoing violence. The sword was both a weapon and a symbol of honor, wielded not only for defense, but to assert social standing. The psychological impact of living under such constant threat was profound. Anxiety, distrust, and the need for vigilance shaped social behavior. People formed alliances and networks to protect themselves, yet suspicion could corrode community bonds. The fear of attack made even routine activities fraught with tension. Trust was earned cautiously, and betrayal was feared. Yet amidst the danger, resilience and ingenuity emerged. Some communities established neighborhood watchers or organized armed escorts for travelers. Stories of brave defenders and clever escapes inspired hope. Markets operated under the watchful eyes of guilds, whose members enforced rules and provided mutual support. Religious institutions sometimes offered sanctuary and mediation, acting as stabilizing forces. Women, children, and the elderly bore disproportionate burdens, vulnerable to exploitation and violence. Their survival depended on protective social networks. Convents and charitable houses provided refuge, but such options were limited. The precariousness of their situation underscored the brutality of medieval life. In the cacophony of medieval towns and countryside, crime and violence were ever-present shadows. The clanging of weapons, the hurried footsteps of fleeing victims, and the cries of anger or pain created a relentless backdrop. Navigating this world required constant alertness and adaptability. The struggle to survive on these streets was not only physical but deeply psychological, shaping generations in a world where safety was never guaranteed. The intertwining of crime and daily life in medieval towns shaped the way people moved through their world. Children learned early to be cautious, quickly understanding which streets to avoid and when to seek shelter. Tradespeople often closed their shops before nightfall, securing their goods behind heavy wooden shutters. Even the bravest souls took precautions, carrying knives or clubs, traveling in groups, or choosing well-lit routes to minimize risk. The role of the watchman and night guards was both vital and limited. These men, often volunteers or poorly paid, patrolled the streets armed with staffs or simple weapons. Their presence was more a deterrent than an effective means of defense. Without organized police forces, law enforcement was reactive and inconsistent, leaving much of the burden of protection on individuals and communities themselves. Markets and fairs, though centers of commerce and socialization, were also hotspots for crime. The bustle of crowds provided cover for pickpockets and con artists, while disputes could quickly escalate into violence. Vendors sometimes formed alliances to protect their interests, employing rough tactics against thieves or troublesome customers. The market square was both a place of livelihood and danger, where trust was fragile and every transaction carried risk. Stories of notorious criminals and bandit leaders circulated widely, their exploits both feared and romanticized. Figures like Robin Hood, though more legend than historical fact, reflected the social tensions of the time, a desire for justice amid widespread lawlessness. Real bandits operated with brutal efficiency, striking swiftly and disappearing into forests or urban labyrinths. Their actions contributed to a climate of fear, but also underscored the limits of medieval authority. The psychological weight of this violence shaped societal attitudes toward safety and justice. Communities developed unwritten codes of conduct, emphasizing loyalty, honor, and retribution. Personal defense was a necessity, and many carried weapons at all times. The concept of self-help justice prevailed, with families and guilds often taking matters into their own hands, in some cases. This led to cycles of revenge that perpetuated violence across generations. Feuds could destroy entire families or destabilize regions, illustrating the fragile balance between order and chaos. Efforts by rulers and church authorities to impose peace, such as the Peace and Truce of God movements, aimed to curb violence, but met with mixed success. Despite the pervasive dangers, medieval towns remained vibrant centers of life and culture. People adapted, finding moments of joy and connection amid hardship. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and communal gatherings offered reprieve and reinforced social bonds. These occasions were marked by music, dance, and feasting, brief windows of safety in an otherwise perilous world. The sights, sounds, and experiences of medieval crime and violence paint a vivid picture of a society in constant tension. The narrow streets filled with shadows, the clanging of swords, the cries of the oppressor contributed to a world where survival demanded vigilance, courage, and sometimes ruthlessness. Understanding this harsh reality adds depth to our view of medieval life, highlighting the resilience and complexity of people who navigated a world fraught with threats, both seen and unseen. Their stories remind us of the enduring human struggle to create safety and community in the face of adversity. From the first light of dawn until the fading glow of evening, medieval laborers toiled relentlessly under the weight of survival. Their lives were defined by the brutal demands of physical work, a daily battle against exhaustion, injury, and the unforgiving elements. Fields had to be plowed, crops sown and harvested by hand, livestock tended, and tools crafted, all without the aid of modern machinery or protective equipment. This constant exertion shaped bodies, hardened by effort and scarred by accidents. Farming was the backbone of medieval society, but it was backbreaking and perilous work. Plowing fields with wooden plows, pulled by oxen or horses, required immense strength and stamina. The ground was uneven and often rocky, tearing at feet clad in simple leather shoes, or going barefoot altogether. Hands blistered and cracked from gripping rough wooden handles. Muscles ached from repetitive motions, and the sun's harsh rays beat down mercilessly during summer months. Harvest season brought long hours bending over crops, wielding sickles, and carrying heavy bundles. Each day risked injury from sharp tools, animal kicks, or falls. Blacksmiths labored in hot, smoky workshops where molten metal was shaped by hammer blows. The air was thick with heat and the sharp scent of burning coal. Hammering iron required precision and brute force, and the clang of metal on metal rang continuously. The work was dangerous. Hot sparks could cause severe burns, and heavy tools could crush fingers or toes. The deafening noise, battered ears, and the physical toll left smiths sweat-soaked and exhausted. Despite these risks, blacksmiths were vital, producing weapons, tools, and household items essential to survival. Other trades demanded similar strength and resilience. Carpenters lifted heavy beams, masons chiseled stone blocks, and weavers worked long hours at looms. Each craft came with its own hazards: dust, inhalation, cuts, repetitive strain, injuries, all compounded by limited understanding of health and safety. Protective gear was non-existent, and workers accepted pain and injury as inevitable parts of their trade. The toll of such labor extended beyond immediate physical strain. Chronic conditions like arthritis, muscle degeneration, and respiratory illnesses were common among workers. Back pain, joint stiffness, and vision problems limited productivity and quality of life. Yet, the lack of effective healthcare meant many suffered in silence, unable to find relief or treatment. Accidents were frequent and often severe. Falls from scaffolding, crush injuries from heavy loads, and burns from open flames filled the ranks of the injured. With no hospitals or professional medical care nearby, victims relied on family members or local healers armed with rudimentary remedies. Infection was a constant threat. Minor wounds could fester, leading to amputation or death. The psychological impact of such injuries, fear, frustration, and despair added to the burden. Nutrition played a critical role in workers' ability to endure. Yet, as explored earlier, food scarcity and poor diet left many malnourished and weak. Fatigue was both physical and mental, a cycle difficult to break without adequate rest and sustenance. Seasonal fluctuations further affected labor capacity. Winter's cold limited outdoor work, while summer heat exacerbated exhaustion. The environment itself was often hostile. Weather conditions, rain, mud, snow, and scorching sun added to the difficulty of labor. Fields became muddy quagmires, making plowing treacherous. Heatstroke and hypothermia were risks that workers faced regularly. Clothing was ill-suited for protection, often thin and worn, offering little defense against the elements. Despite these hardships, community and cooperation provided some relief. Families and neighbors often worked together during critical periods, such as planting and harvest. Shared labor lightened individual loads and fostered social bonds. Yet, these efforts were insufficient to fully mitigate the harsh realities of medieval work. The physical and emotional exhaustion experienced by laborers shaped their worldview and culture. Stories, songs, and traditions celebrated endurance and the dignity of honest toil. Yet, beneath these expressions lay the stark truth of a life marked by hardship and struggle. The sensory experience of medieval labor was vivid and relentless. The rough texture of wood and stone, the burning heat of forge fires, the scent of sweat and earth, the aching muscles and bruised skin. These details bring to life the human cost of survival in a world without modern comforts. Understanding the burdens of medieval labor deepens our appreciation for the resilience and determination of those who lived through these times. Their daily fight to sustain themselves and their communities stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of adversity. The dawn often broke with a chill that bit through the threadbare clothing of the laborers as they prepared for another day of backbreaking work. Hands hardened by years of toil gripped wooden tools, plows, hammers, sickles that felt rough and splintered against their skin. Each motion was practiced but demanding, the repetitive strain echoing in aching joints and weary muscles. The scent of damp earth mingled with sweat and smoke from nearby hearths, creating an atmosphere heavy with exertion. Farmers battled the elements, pushing through muddy fields that clung to boots and dragged down plows. The soil was uneven, strewn with stones and roots that made every step hazardous. The sun climbed steadily, and the heat bore down relentlessly, turning the earth dry and cracked. Long hours under this sun led to sunburned skin and parched throats. Yet the work pressed on. The harvest season was a race against time. Crops had to be gathered before frost or rot claimed the yield. Every moment counted, and fatigue was a constant companion. In blacksmith workshops, the air shimmered with heat, the glow of molten metal lit faces slick with sweat, their expressions taut with concentration. The pounding of hammer against anvil was rhythmic and unyielding, each strike shaping tools and weapons essential for survival. Sparks flew like tiny stars, occasionally landing on skin or clothing, causing burns that were treated with herbal salves but left lasting scars. The workers' lungs were heavy from coal, dust, and smoke, their coughs a testament to years spent in this harsh environment. Carpenters and masons faced their own challenges. The scent of freshly cut wood and mortar filled the air as they labored to build homes, bridges, and fortifications. Lifting heavy beams and stones strained muscles and tested endurance. One misstep could lead to serious injury, yet safety measures were rudimentary at best. Scaffoldings were makeshift, and accidents common. The pain of bruises, cuts, and broken bones was part of the cost of constructing the very world they lived. Women also contributed significantly to the physical labor. They carried water from wells, prepared meals over smoky fires, tended gardens, and cared for children and elders. Their days were filled with endless tasks requiring strength and stamina. The constant movement and heavy loads took a toll on their bodies, yet their resilience was formidable. The physical pain experienced by medieval laborers was often endured silently. There was little opportunity for rest or recovery, and social expectations demanded perseverance. Chronic conditions, arthritis, hernias, and back problems were common, but poorly understood. Treatments were limited to rudimentary remedies and faith-based interventions. The absence of effective pain relief meant that many lived with constant discomfort. Nutrition, as previously discussed, was frequently insufficient to support such demanding work. The combination of poor diet and physical strain left many weakened, more susceptible to illness and injury. This vicious cycle made the endurance of daily labor an extraordinary feat. Injuries were not only physically debilitating but could lead to economic ruin. A disabled laborer might be unable to provide for their family, leading to poverty and social marginalization. Communities often rallied to support the injured, but resources were scarce, and survival remained precarious. The sensory landscape of medieval labor was intense. The rough bark of trees, the gritty feel of soil, the biting sting of splinters, and the searing heat of forge flames. These sensations, combined with the ever-present fatigue and pain, painted a vivid portrait of a life defined by effort and endurance. Despite these hardships, medieval workers found ways to maintain hope and purpose. Festivals and religious observances provided breaks from toil, opportunities to rest and celebrate. Stories and songs celebrated the dignity of labor and the strength of the human spirit. The bonds formed through shared work and mutual support fostered resilience. Understanding the harsh physical realities of medieval labor enriches our view of history. It reveals the daily courage and determination required to survive and build communities in a world lacking modern comforts and protections. The relentless cycle of work extended beyond the fields and workshops to the very structures that housed medieval communities. Builders and craftsmen labored tirelessly to erect sturdy homes and fortifications, often under dangerous and physically taxing conditions. Stonemasons chiseled away at massive blocks, their hands numb from the cold and their bodies strained from heavy lifting. The smell of wet stone mingled with sweat and dust, filling the air with the gritty reality of construction life. Farmhands faced unpredictable weather, battling scorching heat, driving rain, and biting cold. Their clothes, made from rough wool or linen, offered scant protection, becoming soaked and heavy in rain or freezing stiff in winter. The dampness seeped into bones, causing chronic pain and illness. Blisters and calluses marked their hands, trophies of daily endurance. Blacksmiths worked in searing heat, their faces flushed and hands raw from gripping hot metal. Sparks from the forge could ignite fires, and burns were an occupational hazard. The rhythmic pounding of hammer on anvil was a brutal dance, demanding strength and precision. Yet, these artisans were indispensable. Their labor-sustaining tools, weapons, and countless household items. Women's labor, though often less visible, was equally demanding. They managed domestic tasks, carrying water, preparing food over smoky fires, spinning wool, and caring for children and elders. Their days were long, with few moments of rest, and their bodies bore the wear of constant movement and heavy burdens. The physical toll of childbirth and children compounded their hardships. Injuries were common and often severe. Without modern medicine, even minor wounds could become fatal. Infections ran rampant, and amputations were performed without anesthesia. The loss of a hand or foot could mean the end of one's ability to work, plunging families into poverty. Nutrition was inadequate to meet the demands of such labor. Many workers suffered from exhaustion, weakened immune systems, and chronic ailments. The struggle to balance work and health was a daily reality, one that few escaped unscathed. Despite these challenges, communities found strength in cooperation. Families and neighbors worked side by side during critical periods, such as planting and harvest. Shared labor eased burdens and reinforced social bonds. Festivals and religious observances offered respite and renewal. The sensory experience of medieval labor, the smell of fresh earth, the sting of cold wind, the sound of hammering, and the feel of rough tools immerses us in the lived reality of survival. These details illuminate the resilience and humanity of those who built and sustained medieval society through sheer determination. The daily grind wore heavily on the spirit, as well as the body. The constant ache of sore muscles and bruised skin was compounded by the mental exhaustion of relentless toil. Workers rose before sunrise, their bodies still aching from the previous day, and pressed on regardless. The satisfaction of a hard day's work was often tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same or greater challenges. Yet, there was a quiet dignity in this endurance, a testament to the human will to survive. The toll of physical labor extended into old age. Many never escaped the burden of lifelong work, their bodies bent and scarred by decades of exertion. The lack of pensions or social safety nets meant that the elderly depended on family or charity. Their health deteriorated by years of hardship. Amid these hardships, medieval workers found moments of joy and camaraderie. Shared meals after a day of labor, stories told by the fire, and communal celebrations punctuated the calendar. These social connections provided essential emotional support, strengthening resilience. The harshness of medieval labor shaped culture and identity. Songs and tales celebrated heroes of toil, and craftsmanship was highly valued. The legacy of these workers endures in the structures they built and the traditions they passed down. Understanding the burden of labor in the Middle Ages offers profound insight into the lived experiences of our ancestors. Their strength, pain, and perseverance are woven into the fabric of history, reminding us of the enduring human capacity to endure and overcome. The rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages cast a long, oppressive shadow over the lives of the vast majority. For peasants and laborers, life was governed by unyielding systems of control and expectation that shaped not only their daily actions but also their very thoughts and emotions. From dawn to dusk, these social pressures bore down heavily, weaving a complex web of fear, obedience, and resignation. Living under the rule of lords and nobles meant more than just economic subsistence. It demanded acceptance of a place in an ordered universe where mobility was rare and freedom limited. The weight of this social order pressed deeply on minds and hearts. Peasants labored tirelessly, knowing that their work sustained not only their own families but the wealth and power of those above them. This knowledge bred a quiet, simmering tension, a mix of duty, frustration, and helplessness. The threat of punishment for defiance or failure was ever present. Harsh laws enforced the boundaries of behavior, with penalties ranging from fines and confiscation of property to imprisonment or corporal punishment. Lords held court with the power to determine fate, and the fear of retribution kept many in strict compliance. This created a climate of anxiety and submission, where even small acts of resistance could provoke severe consequences. Surveillance was pervasive. Lords and their agents monitored the activities of peasants, ensuring taxes were paid and obligations met. Gossip and accusations could lead to investigations or harsher scrutiny. This constant watchfulness eroded privacy and fostered mistrust within communities, fracturing social bonds. The psychological impact of this oppression was profound. Many experienced feelings of powerlessness and despair, trapped in roles dictated by birth and circumstance. The lack of autonomy undermined self-esteem and fostered a sense of fatalism. Dreams of escape or improvement were often stifled by harsh realities and societal norms. Religion played a dual role in this mental landscape. On one hand, faith offered solace and a framework for understanding suffering as part of a divine plan. Church teachings emphasized humility, obedience, and acceptance, reinforcing social hierarchies as ordained by God. On the other hand, religious rituals and community gatherings provided moments of connection, support, and shared hope. Communal festivals and church events were bright spots in otherwise monotonous lives, occasions for rest, celebration, and spiritual renewal. These gatherings helped alleviate mental strain, reminding people of their place in a larger cosmic order and offering brief respite from toil and oppression. Yet, beneath these moments of relief lay the grinding reality of limited freedom. Peasants had little control over their lives, their work, marriage, and residence often dictated by lords. Travel required permission, and opportunities for education or advancement were scarce. This lack of agency contributed to widespread resignation and acceptance of social roles. Mental health challenges, though poorly understood and rarely recorded, were likely common. Chronic stress, anxiety, and depression would have accompanied the daily hardships and social constraints. Without modern psychological support or awareness, individuals coped as best they could, drawing on faith, family, and community. The oppressive social hierarchy also influenced family dynamics. Patriarchal structures reinforced authority within households, with strict roles and expectations. Women, in particular, faced additional layers of control and limitation, responsible for domestic duties and child rearing within a constrained social framework. Their voices were often marginalized, and their opportunities severely limited. Despite these constraints, human resilience persisted. Stories of defiance, subtle resistance, and community solidarity hint at the enduring spirit beneath oppression. Folk tales, songs, and local customs preserved a sense of identity and hope, transmitting values and narratives that sustained morale. The sensory world of social oppression was subtle yet pervasive. The heavy footsteps of tax collectors, the stern gaze of a lord steward, whispered rumors in village squares, all conveyed the omnipresence of control. The tension in hushed conversations and the nervous glances exchanged spoke volumes about lives lived under scrutiny. Understanding the mental strain imposed by medieval social hierarchy deepens our appreciation for the lived experience of those who endured it. Their stories revealed the complex interplay of power, fear, and resilience that defined their world, offering timeless insights into human psychology under oppression. The burden of social hierarchy weighed heavily on every aspect of daily life. Peasants rose early, their movements dictated not only by the demands of labor, but also by the watchful eyes of those who held authority. Every task was performed under the implicit pressure of scrutinized deadlines, or perceived slights could lead to punishment, increased toil, or loss of privileges. The fear of these consequences created a pervasive sense of anxiety that shadowed even the smallest actions. Community gatherings, while moments of relief, were also arenas of social reinforcement. Status was displayed through clothing, possessions, and behavior, reminding all of their place in the social order. Those of lower rank were expected to show deference, humility, and obedience. Failure to conform risked ostracization or harsher penalties. This constant performance of submission drained mental energy and stifled individuality. The physical spaces people inhabited reflected and reinforced their social positions. Lords lived in imposing stone manor houses or castles, symbols of power and control. Peasants, by contrast, dwelled in cramped, poorly constructed huts, often with little protection from the elements. These conditions contributed to feelings of inferiority and entrapment. As physical surroundings mirrored social realities, education was a rare privilege, mostly reserved for clergy and nobility. For peasants, illiteracy was the norm, limiting access to knowledge and reinforcing dependency. The absence of education curtailed opportunities for social mobility, deepening the psychological divide between classes. Religious teachings both comforted and constrained. The Church preached the virtues of patience, obedience, and acceptance of one's earthly station. The promise of heavenly reward was a powerful tool for maintaining order, encouraging people to endure suffering with faith. Yet, this spiritual framework also discouraged questioning and rebellion, reinforcing the mental chains of social oppression. Women faced unique challenges within this hierarchy. Their roles were confined largely to domestic spheres, and they were subject to both patriarchal authority and economic dependency. The mental strain of managing households, bearing children, and navigating social expectations was immense. Women had limited legal rights and few avenues for personal agency, adding to their psychological burden. Despite these harsh realities, pockets of resistance and hope persisted. Folklore and oral traditions preserved stories of heroes, tricksters, and outcasts who challenged authority or found clever ways to survive. These narratives offered subtle critiques of power and provided mental escape from the rigors of daily life. Mental health, while not recognized in medieval terms, was undeniably affected by these pressures. Chronic stress and anxiety would have manifested in physical symptoms: fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, compounding the toll of hard labor and poor living conditions. Without formal support, people relied on community networks, religious faith, and personal resilience to cope. Social oppression also influenced relationships. Trust was tempered by fear, and alliances were often fragile. The threat of betrayal or punishment made social interactions cautious and calculated. Yet, strong bonds of kinship and friendship provided emotional sustenance, helping individuals endure the psychological strain. The sounds and sights of medieval social life, commands barked by overseers, the heavy footsteps of officials, whispered warnings, created an atmosphere of control and unease. People learned to read these signs and navigate their world with care. The ever-present tension shaped behaviors, attitudes, and community dynamics in profound ways. The psychological burden of living within such a rigid and unforgiving social system often manifested in subtle but profound ways. Many individuals internalized the hierarchy, accepting their place as predetermined and unchangeable. This acceptance brought with it a complex mix of resignation and suppressed frustration. The mental exhaustion from constant obedience and the denial of personal ambition weighed heavily on many souls. Even if unspoken, the daily interactions between peasants and their lords were fraught with tension, requiring careful navigation. A simple glance or tone could be misinterpreted, leading to accusations of disrespect or rebellion. This environment fostered a culture of self-censorship and hyper-awareness, where people constantly monitored their words and actions to avoid punishment. Communities developed unwritten codes to manage these pressures. Mutual aid and cooperation among peasants became crucial survival strategies, providing emotional support and practical help. Festivals and religious ceremonies, while reinforcing the social order, also created spaces for shared joy and collective identity, momentarily lifting the weight of oppression. The mental strain also affected family dynamics. Generations grew up knowing their roles, yet dreams of change simmered beneath the surface. Stories passed down through families often contained hints of hope and subtle resistance, preserving the spirit of those who longed for a different life. Women, in particular, bore dual burdens: subservience within the social hierarchy and the demands of family and household management. The emotional labor required to maintain family cohesion under harsh conditions was immense. Yet, women found strength in networks of kinship and friendship. Sharing knowledge and support, religious faith remained a cornerstone of psychological resilience. The promise of salvation and a better afterlife offered comfort against the hardships of earthly existence. Pilgrimages, prayer, and participation in sacraments provided structure and meaning, helping individuals cope with mental distress. The constant presence of social control and the threat of punishment created a climate where fear shaped every interaction. This pervasive anxiety affected physical health, relationships, and community cohesion. Yet, within this environment, human resilience persisted, manifesting in acts of kindness, solidarity, and quiet defiance. The sensory world of medieval social oppression, stern voices, heavy footsteps of authority, whispered warnings, created an atmosphere charged with tension. Navigating this world demanded not only physical endurance, but mental fortitude, a balancing act between survival and self-preservation. Recognizing the mental strain of medieval social hierarchy deepens our understanding of history, revealing the psychological costs of oppression alongside its physical and economic impacts. These insights remind us of the enduring human capacity to endure hardship while yearning for dignity and freedom. The relentless pressures of medieval social hierarchy also fostered a culture of resilience born from necessity. People learned to find meaning and small freedoms within the confines of their station. Folk traditions, storytelling, and music offered outlets for expression and subtle resistance. These cultural practices nurtured hope and identity, sustaining communities through hardship. Communal work projects, shared celebrations, and religious festivals provided opportunities to strengthen social bonds and momentarily ease the psychological weight of daily oppression. In these moments, individuals could experience connection, joy, and a sense of purpose beyond their immediate struggles. Education and literacy were rare among the lower classes, but oral traditions ensured that knowledge, values, and stories passed through generations. These narratives often contained coded messages of endurance and the possibility of change, empowering listeners even in a rigid system. The mental strain of living under constant social control also manifested in coping mechanisms. Prayer, superstition, and ritual offered comfort and a semblance of control in an unpredictable world. People sought protection from evil spirits, divine punishment, and misfortune through charms, pilgrimages, and participation in communal rites. At the same time, fear could breed suspicion and division within communities. Accusations of wrongdoing or disloyalty threatened social cohesion, requiring careful navigation of interpersonal relationships. Trust was hard-won and easily lost, adding another layer of complexity to daily life. Despite these challenges, many found ways to nurture hope and resilience. Acts of kindness, mutual support, and quiet resistance demonstrated the human spirit's capacity to adapt and survive. These behaviors preserved communities and fostered continuity amidst adversity. The sights, sounds, and emotions of medieval social oppression paint a complex picture of a world defined by power and submission, but also by connection and endurance. The psychological landscape shaped lives as profoundly as physical conditions, influencing attitudes, behaviors, and social structures. In the shadowed corners of medieval life, superstition and fear thrived like unwelcome specters, weaving through every aspect of existence. The unknown was a vast and terrifying landscape, and in the absence of scientific understanding, people turned to belief in the supernatural to explain the inexplicable. Illness, crop failure, misfortune, and even death were attributed to curses, evil spirits, or the malevolent work of witches. This pervasive worldview cast a long, dark shadow over communities, shaping behavior and mental states in profound ways. Rituals and ceremonies designed to appease or ward off these unseen forces punctuated the calendar. The flickering glow of candles and the sharp scent of burning herbs filled cramped chambers as priests and laypeople alike sought protection through prayer and incantation. The rhythmic chanting and solemn gestures created an atmosphere thick with tension and hope, a fragile barrier against the ever-present threat of misfortune. Public executions were grim spectacles, held in market squares or churchyards, where the accused, often women labeled as witches or heretics, faced brutal deaths. The sound of crackling flames, the cries of the condemned, and the murmurs of the crowd blended into a haunting chorus of fear and fascination. These events served both as warnings and communal catharsis, reinforcing social norms while feeding the collective dread. The fear of witchcraft and demonic influence permeated daily life. Accusations could arise from envy, fear, or misunderstanding, leading to social ostracism, imprisonment, or execution. The mere suspicion of maleficence was enough to destroy reputations and lives. This culture of suspicion eroded trust, making communities wary and fragmented. Superstition also influenced personal behavior and mental well-being. People adopted rituals, charms, and taboos to protect themselves and their families. The wearing of amulets, the sprinkling of holy water, and adherence to prescribed fasting or prayer schedules were common. These practices provided a sense of control in a world fraught with uncertainty, but also fostered anxiety and paranoia. The sensory landscape of this fear-filled world was vivid. The sharp odor of burning herbs, the flicker of torchlight against ancient stone, the hushed whispers of conspiracy. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and every unexplained event and illness, a failed harvest, a sudden death, became fodder for suspicion. Religious institutions wielded significant influence in shaping these beliefs. The Church taught that the devil was an active force in the world, constantly seeking souls to corrupt. Clergy conducted exorcisms, delivered sermons warning of sin, and sanctioned the persecution of those deemed dangerous. This doctrine instilled both fear and obedience, intertwining spiritual salvation with social conformity. Mental health suffered under these conditions. The constant fear of unseen enemies, combined with social pressures and harsh living conditions, contributed to widespread anxiety and despair. People struggled to discern reality from superstition, their perceptions clouded by the weight of cultural beliefs. Yet, amid this atmosphere of dread, communities also found ways to cope. Shared rituals, festivals, and religious observances provided moments of unity and comfort. The collective expression of fear became a form of social cohesion, binding individuals together against common threats, real or imagined. The shadow of superstition stretched across every corner of medieval society, influencing not only public actions, but also the intimate thoughts of individuals. Daily decisions were often guided by omens, dreams, and signs interpreted through a lens of fear and faith. A sudden illness, an unexpected storm, or a child's strange behavior might be seen as evidence of witchcraft or divine displeasure. This constant search for meaning in misfortune heightened anxiety and fostered a sense of vulnerability. Communities developed intricate systems of beliefs and practices aimed at managing uncertainty. Folk remedies mingled with religious rites. Charms woven from herbs and bones were tucked into clothing, and crosses or holy relics were placed in homes for protection. People carried tokens believed to ward off evil, and ceremonies marking life's milestones were imbued with symbolic acts meant to ensure safety and blessing. Witch hunts, fueled by fear and suspicion, reached terrifying heights in some regions. Accusations could be sparked by jealousy, personal grudges, or the need to explain tragic events. Trials were often swift and brutal, relying on spectral evidence, forced confessions, or the testimony of neighbors. The condemned faced torture and execution, their deaths serving as grim warnings to others. These persecutions not only destroyed lives but also shattered the social fabric, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia. Religious leaders played a dual role, providing comfort through spiritual guidance while also enforcing doctrines that fueled fear. The Church's emphasis on sin and punishment created a moral framework that equated misfortune with moral failing. Confession, penance, and obedience were prescribed paths to redemption, but failure to conform could lead to suspicion or condemnation. The sensory experiences of this fearful world were stark and unforgettable. The crackle of fire in the witch trials, the scent of incense in cathedrals, the murmured prayers in dimly lit chapels all contributed to a charged atmosphere where the supernatural was ever present. Shadows seemed to move with malevolent intent, and the line between reality and fear blurred. Mental strain manifested in both individuals and communities. Anxiety, depression, and paranoia were common. Though unrecognized as such, people sought solace in faith and ritual, yet the pervasive dread left lasting scars. The interplay of hope and fear defined the medieval psyche, shaping responses to the dangers that surrounded them. Despite this oppressive environment, pockets of resistance and skepticism existed. Some questioned the validity of accusations or the harshness of punishments, while others sought to protect the accused. These voices, though often marginalized, remind us of the complex and varied human responses to fear. The legacy of superstition and fear in the Middle Ages serves as a powerful reminder of how uncertainty and the unknown can shape societies. It reveals the deep human need to find meaning and control in chaotic circumstances, even when such attempts lead to tragedy. The interplay between superstition and everyday life extended into health and healing practices, where fear of the unknown guided both remedies and rituals. People turned to apothecaries, folk healers, and clergy for cures that combined herbal knowledge with spiritual intervention. Treatments often involved prayers, incantations, and the use of relics believed to possess protective power. This fusion of medicine and religion aimed to address not only the body's ailments but also the soul's vulnerabilities to evil forces. Public gatherings often included rituals intended to purify communities and ward off disease or misfortune. Processions, blessings, and exorcisms were performed with fervent belief, their sensory elements, chanting incense, flickering candles, creating immersive experiences that reinforced communal bonds and offered hope. These acts, while rooted in fear, also fostered a sense of unity and shared purpose. Witch hunts, tragic as they were, can be seen within this broader context of attempting to control chaos. Accusations often targeted those on society's healers, the poor reflecting underlying social tensions and fears. The trials and executions that followed disrupted communities, but also functioned as grim reminders of the power structures that maintained order through fear. The psychological landscape of the Middle Ages was thus shaped by a constant tension between hope and dread, faith and suspicion, the sensory world codes of chance, the smell of burning herbs, the flicker of torchlight immersed individuals in an atmosphere where the supernatural was never far away. This environment affected behavior, relationships, and social dynamics profoundly. Yet, amid this climate of fear, medieval people demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They created systems of belief and practice that allowed them to navigate uncertainty, finding comfort and meaning despite the risks. These cultural responses highlight the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming anxiety. The lasting impact of medieval superstition and fear is evident in art, literature, and cultural memory. Themes of good versus evil, redemption through faith, and the struggle against dark forces continue to resonate. Understanding this history enriches our perspective on how societies cope with uncertainty and the unknown. The deep-rooted fear of the supernatural shaped not only communal practices but also personal lives. Everyday actions were often guided by rituals designed to prevent misfortune. Mothers whispered prayers over their children, farmers blessed their fields, and merchants performed small offerings before setting out to trade. These practices provided a sense of agency in an unpredictable world, where invisible forces seemed to govern fate. The atmosphere in medieval towns during times of crisis, be it disease outbreaks, famine, or war, was thick with superstition. Tension rumors spread quickly, often escalating fears and leading to scapegoating. Entire families or individuals could be ostracized based on little more than suspicion or misfortune. This climate bred a pervasive sense of insecurity, where trust was fragile and survival depended on vigilance. Despite the darkness cast by fear, medieval society also valued courage and moral strength. Stories of saints, martyrs, and heroes offered models for confronting evil and adversity. These narratives reinforced the hope that faith and righteousness could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The sensory details of superstition and fear, the flicker of candlelight during midnight prayers, the distant wails from a witch trial, the scent of burning wood and herbs paint a vivid picture of medieval life's emotional landscape. This world, rich in symbolism and ritual, was as much about managing the mind's fears as confronting real dangers. Living in this environment required a delicate balance between acceptance and resistance. People navigated complex social and spiritual terrains, finding moments of joy, connection, and meaning amid pervasive uncertainty. Communities often relied on rituals that blended ancient traditions with Christian beliefs to maintain a fragile sense of order. Seasonal festivals like Samhain and the Christian All Saints' Day blurred together, marking times when the veil between worlds was thought to be thin. People lit bonfires, hung protective herbs, and performed rites to safeguard against malevolent spirits. The sensory atmosphere of these events, the crackling flames, the scent of burning herbs, the chants of gathered villagers, offered a collective experience that was both fearful and comforting. Fear of witchcraft and the supernatural also influenced law and governance. Authorities enacted laws targeting supposed practitioners of dark arts, leading to inquisitions and trials. These legal actions were as much about asserting power and control as addressing genuine fears. The dramatic public spectacles of trials and executions served to reinforce social hierarchies and suppress dissent. In daily life, individuals adopted superstitions that permeated even mundane tasks. Carrying charms, avoiding certain days or activities, and interpreting dreams were common practices. This constant vigilance against unseen dangers shaped behavior and social interaction, fostering a worldview where luck and fate were intertwined with moral conduct. The mental strain of living under such conditions was significant. The interplay of religious teachings, folklore, and personal belief created a complex psychological environment. People sought meaning and security through faith and ritual, even as fear persisted. This tension influenced art, literature, and culture, leaving a lasting imprint on European history. Despite the pervasive fear, medieval society also exhibited moments of compassion and solidarity. Communities rallied to support those accused or suffering, and religious institutions provided care and sanctuary. These acts of kindness offered respite from the harshness of superstition-driven life. The legacy of medieval superstition and fear serves as a reminder of humanity's need to understand and control the unknown. It highlights the power of belief to shape societies and individual lives. For better or worse, the intertwining of superstition, fear, and religion in medieval life shaped not only communal behavior, but also deeply personal experiences. Individuals carried the weight of these beliefs into their homes, influencing family dynamics, children, and daily routines. Parents taught children prayers and protective rituals, instilling a cautious respect for the unseen. The fear of curses or demonic influence permeated even the most intimate moments, coloring interactions with a mix of reverence and anxiety. In the marketplace and town squares, whispers of witches and curses could spread like wildfire, turning neighbors against one another. Accusations were sometimes motivated by jealousy, greed, or personal vendettas, but the consequences were severe. The accused faced trials where evidence was scant and justice precarious, often ending in torture or execution. This culture of suspicion sowed mistrust and fear, fracturing communities and isolating individuals. Despite these dark undercurrents, medieval people sought solace in the tangible family, faith, and tradition. Religious festivals offered structured opportunities to confront fear collectively, providing rituals that reinforced hope and social cohesion. Music, dance, and shared meals punctuated the calendar, reminding people of life's joys amid uncertainty. The sensory world of superstition and fear was rich and immersive. The flicker of candlelight casting dancing shadows, the murmured prayers in quiet chapels, the pungent scent of burning herbs, and the sharp clang of church bells calling the faithful. These elements created an environment where the spiritual and material were inseparably entwined, shaping perceptions and actions. Mental health struggles, though unacknowledged in medieval terms, were real and pervasive. Anxiety, depression, and trauma likely affected many, exacerbated by the stresses of poverty, disease, and social control. Coping mechanisms included prayer, communal support, and ritual participation, offering some relief in a harsh world. Studying this facet of medieval life offers profound insights into the human condition, the ways in which fear and belief intersect to influence societies and individuals. It reveals resilience amidst adversity and the enduring quest for meaning in the face of the unknown. As daylight faded, the medieval world transformed into a realm of shadows and uncertainty. Nightfall brought an eerie silence that contrasted sharply with the day's clamor, silence thick with anticipation and fear. The absence of light erased familiar shapes and paths, leaving people vulnerable to dangers both natural and human. The chill of the night air seeped into bones, a cold that no coarse wool or thick cloak could fully repel. Darkness became an enemy as palpable as any beast or bandit, turning every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig into a potential threat. Wolves prowled the outskirts of villages and forests, their glowing eyes reflecting the faintest light. Packs hunted stealthily, their howls echoing through the night, sending shivers down the spines of those huddled indoors. Stories of wolf attacks were common, and fear of these predators kept many from venturing outside after dusk. The scent of smoke from hearth fires mingled with the damp earth and pine, offering both comfort and a reminder of the tenuous boundary between safety and wilderness. Fires posed another deadly risk in the darkness. Wooden homes, tightly packed and constructed from flammable materials, could be consumed swiftly, especially with no organized firefighting services. A single spark, whether from a hearth or accident, could ignite a devastating blaze, leaving families homeless and exposed to the night's dangers. The crackling of flames, the acrid smell of smoke, and the desperate cries of those trapped painted harrowing scenes of nocturnal peril. Human threats intensified under the cover of night. Bandits and thieves exploited darkness to ambush travelers or raid homes. The absence of light and the limited reach of night watchmen emboldened criminals, making the streets far more dangerous. People relied on rudimentary locks, barred doors, and the watchful presence of neighbors to deter attacks. Yet the sense of vulnerability was ever present. The sensory experience of night in the medieval world was a mix of stark contrasts. The comforting warmth of a flickering fire inside versus the cold, forbidding darkness outside. The quiet murmur of prayers blending with the distant howl of wolves. The soft rustle of curtains juxtaposed with the sharp clatter of distant footsteps. These elements combined to create an atmosphere charged with tension and unease. Children were especially vulnerable at night, their cries easily lost in the vast silence. Families gathered close, seeking warmth and protection. Yet even within walls, fears persisted. The unknown lurked just beyond the threshold, making rest elusive. Communities developed various strategies to survive the night. Watch rotations, guard dogs, and signal fires were employed to alert inhabitants of danger. Stories and rituals aimed to comfort the fearful, while prayers sought divine protection. Yet no measure could entirely dispel the primal dread that darkness inspired. Reflecting on the manifold threats that compounded with nightfall, it becomes clear why surviving even a single day and, especially, its dark hours, in the Middle Ages, was a formidable challenge. The convergence of natural predators, human malefactors, and environmental hazards under the cloak of night transformed the world into a perilous landscape. Each hour brought uncertainty, demanding vigilance, courage, and a measure of luck. The onset of night not only intensified the dangers lurking outside, but also revealed the vulnerabilities within. With limited sources of light, mostly flickering candles, smoky torches, or small hearth fires, shadows stretched and warped, creating an eerie maze within homes and streets. The unreliable glow offered scant reassurance. Every creak of timber or whisper of wind was magnified in the darkness, fueling imagination and dread. Villagers often huddled together for warmth and safety, sharing tight spaces that barely kept the chill at bay. The rough texture of straw bedding, the coarse weave of woolen blankets, and the faint warmth of bodies pressed close were the few comforts against the encroaching cold. Yet, despite these efforts, sleep was elusive for many, disrupted by the mind's restless vigilance or the cries of children frightened by unseen terrors. Outside, the howl of wolves punctuated the night air, a chilling reminder of nature's indifference. These predators, emboldened by darkness, tested the defenses of settlements, occasionally slipping through gaps or preying on unattended livestock. Their eerie calls echoed across forests and hills, stirring unease and respect among medieval folk fires, though essential for warmth and protection, were double-edged swords. Hearths provided light and heat, but also posed significant risk. Sparks could leap onto thatched roofs, igniting infernos that spread rapidly through closely built wooden structures. Without organized firefighting, towns were vulnerable to devastation, and families could lose everything in a single night. The acrid smoke, crackling flames, and panicked screams created nightmarish scenes etched into the memories of survivors. The absence of modern security meant that human threats also flourished. Nighttime was prime opportunity for thieves, vandals, and worse. Shadows concealed lurking figures, and the muffled sounds of footsteps or whispered plans sent chills through townsfolk. Guard patrols, where they existed, were limited in number and often ill-equipped, their presence more symbolic than effective. The psychological toll of surviving nights filled with such dangers was immense. Chronic sleep deprivation and fear, war on bodies and minds alike, weakening immune systems and heightening stress. People lived in a state of hyper-alertness, their senses sharpened by necessity but fatigued by constant tension. In this world, every creak and rustle could signify danger. The tactile sensation of cold stone walls or rough wooden beams, the bitter taste of smoke-tainted air, and the sight of flickering shadows combined to create an atmosphere heavy with unease. Families clung to each other, whispering prayers and sharing stories to soothe frightened hearts. The mental and physical strain of night survival reinforced social bonds. Communities depended on cooperation and mutual protection, sharing watch duties and pooling resources. Trust, while cautious, was vital for collective security. Amid the pervasive darkness, townspeople developed rituals and practices to create pockets of safety. Bonfires were lit at village centers, their flames reaching skyward as both a deterrent to predators and a beacon of communal strength. The flickering orange light danced against rough stone walls, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to keep malevolent forces at bay. People gathered around these fires, sharing warmth and stories, their voices a gentle murmur against the surrounding stillness. Lanterns and torches, though scarce and costly, were carried by those who dared to travel. After dusk, the soft glow they emitted offered fragile illumination, but also attracted unwanted attention from criminals and wild animals alike. The clinking of metal chains, the rustle of cloaks, and the steady footfalls of watchmen punctuated the night, creating an uneasy rhythm that defined medieval nocturnal life. The chill of the night was relentless. Dampness seeped through clothing and crept into bones, causing shivers that no fire could fully chase away. The texture of coarse wool and scratchy linen provided minimal comfort, their worn fibers offering little protection from the biting cold. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by nightmares or the cries of infants unsettled by shadows. In many households, the sick and elderly faced particular vulnerability. Their frailty made them targets for both natural and human threats. Caregivers worked tirelessly, often sacrificing their own rest to tend to loved ones. The emotional toll of watching over the vulnerable compounded by the ever-present dangers of the night. Fires were also sources of both hope and fear. While they provided light and warmth, the threat of accidental blazes loomed large. Stories of entire hamlets lost to nighttime fires circulated widely, reinforcing caution and the fragile nature of medieval safety. The smell of smoke, the crackle of burning timber, and the sight of glowing embers were constant reminders of both protection and peril. The wilderness beyond village boundaries was a realm of terror after dark. Dense forests hid predators whose eyes gleamed with hunger. The hoot of owls and the snapping of branches stirred anxiety, as travelers feared encounters with wolves or worse. Paths became treacherous in the dark, leading many to avoid nighttime travel altogether. This constant exposure to danger shaped medieval psychology. A pervasive sense of vulnerability and vigilance was ingrained from childhood. Stories and superstitions about spirits, demons, and witches were passed down, often tied to the fears evoked by night's mysteries. These beliefs both comforted and frightened, offering explanations and warnings that guided behavior. The sensory tapestry of medieval night, cold air, flickering firelight, distant howls, and whispered prayers creates an immersive understanding of why surviving even 24 hours was so perilous. Every element combined to challenge the senses and the spirit, demanding endurance beyond the physical. In this harsh environment, the endurance of medieval people stands as a testament to human resilience. Their lives were marked by constant negotiation with danger, a dance between light and shadow, safety and threat. The night was not merely a time for rest, but a crucible where courage and community were tested. The silence that enveloped medieval towns at night was heavy, broken only by occasional sounds that sent pulses of fear through those awake. The distant howl of a wolf, the snap of a twig underfoot, or the sudden bark of a guard dog could trigger a wave of anxiety. These sounds were amplified by the darkness, each noise hinting at unseen dangers lurking just beyond the reach of flickering lantern light. Families clung to each other in their cramped homes, seeking comfort and warmth amid the cold and uncertainty. The rough textures of wooden furniture and stone walls felt unyielding, contrasting with the softness of shared blankets and the reassuring presence of loved ones. The whispered prayers and hushed stories told in the dim glow of a hearth served to soothe restless minds and chase away some of the shadows. Even within the supposed safety of a home, dangers persisted. The risk of fire, the presence of vermin, and the possibility of forced entry kept many vigilant. Locks were crude, and barriers flimsy, yet they provided a semblance of protection in a precarious world. The physical sensation of cold drafts slipping through cracks in walls was a constant reminder of vulnerability. Travelers who found themselves on the road after dark faced a gauntlet of threats. Without modern roads or lighting, navigation was fraught with peril. They depended on the moon and stars for guidance, but dense forests and uneven terrain complicated their journey. The eerie silence of the night was punctuated by distant cries or rustling, reminders that predators, both animal and human, could strike at any moment. Animals played a dual role in this nocturnal world. Domesticated dogs offered protection and companionship, their barks alerting households to approaching danger. Yet, Wild beasts prowled nearby, their movements stealthy and often deadly. The tension between these forces underscored the precariousness of life after sundown. The psychological impact of living with such nightly threats was immense. Fear was a constant companion, shaping behaviors and limiting freedom. Sleep was a fragile commodity, often interrupted by nightmares or sudden noises. The mind remained alert, scanning for signs of danger even in moments of rest. Medieval societies developed customs to manage these fears. Night watchmen, albeit limited in effectiveness, patrolled streets, and communal agreements dictated when fire should be lit or doors secured. Festivals and religious observances provided occasions to confront darkness together, reinforcing social bonds and collective resilience. The long hours of night often blurred together, each moment stretching under the weight of uncertainty. People learned to balance vigilance with exhaustion, knowing that too much alertness could lead to weariness, but too little risked catastrophe. The physical sensations, aching limbs from a day's labor, the chills seeping through layers of worn clothing, the flicker of candlelight casting uncertain shapes were constant companions in this delicate dance. Children, too young to fully grasp the dangers, found comfort in the stories told by elders, tales woven with caution and hope. These narratives served as both entertainment and instruction, embedding lessons on survival and the importance of respect for the night's power. The natural world played a role in shaping perceptions of night. The phases of the moon guided activities and travel, while seasonal changes affected the length and severity of darkness. Winter nights were especially daunting, with longer hours and harsher cold amplifying the risks. In contrast, summer's shorter nights offered brief reprieves, though the threat of fire remained ever present. In remote villages, the darkness was deeper and more absolute. Without the glow of nearby settlements, the night swallowed sound and sight entirely. People relied on the light of stars and the crackle of fires for orientation. The natural symphony of nocturnal creatures filled the air, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling. The intersection of superstition and night further intensified fears. Darkness was associated with spirits, demons, and other supernatural beings believed to roam freely. Protective charms, prayers, and rituals were common defenses, providing psychological comfort even as they underscored the omnipresence of danger. The sensory fabric of medieval nights, the cold air biting exposed skin, the distant cries echoing through valleys, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows, creates a vivid understanding of the perilous environment. Each detail adds depth to the narrative of survival in a world where darkness was a formidable adversary. This relentless challenge forged a society accustomed to hardship, where courage and community were essential to facing the unknown. The endurance shown by medieval people during these dark hours is a testament to human strength and adaptability. The nightly routine in medieval homes often began well before darkness fully settled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, families hurried to secure their dwellings, reinforcing doors with wooden bars and covering windows with shutters. The scent of burning wood from hearth fires filled rooms, offering warmth and a flickering source of light. The tactile sensation of rough stone walls and uneven wooden floors contrasted with the comforting presence of woven blankets and the soft murmurs of loved ones gathering close. Outside, the streets grew deserted, save for the occasional figure hurrying home or the patrol of night watchmen clanking their staffs. Their presence, while limited in reach, provided a semblance of order in the growing darkness. Lanterns swung from iron hooks, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye, sometimes inspiring fear or superstition. The psychological weight of these nightly preparations was significant. The knowledge of unseen dangers, wild animals, thieves, or worse created a heightened sense of alertness. Sleep was often interrupted by the sounds of distant footsteps, rustling leaves, or the eerie howl of wolves. This fragmented rest compounded the physical exhaustion from daily labor, making the coming day all the more challenging. Children, sensing the anxiety of adults, often clung to parents or older siblings, seeking safety in numbers. Stories told beside the fire included warnings and lessons, teaching caution and respect for the night's power. These tales served to both educate and bond families, weaving a tapestry of shared experience amid uncertainty. In more prosperous homes, additional measures provided comfort and protection. Iron window grates, locked chests, and sturdy doors offered barriers against intrusion. Yet, even these were no guarantee of safety. The unpredictability of medieval nights meant that fear was a constant companion, shaping behaviors and interactions. Travelers, who found themselves on the road as darkness fell, faced heightened risks. Without clear paths or lighting, navigation was fraught with peril. The threat of ambush by bandits or wild animals made solitary journeys especially dangerous. Those who must travel after nightfall often carried weapons or traveled in groups, relying on communal protection to survive the hours until dawn. The physical sensations of medieval night, the sharp cold, the rough textures of clothing and shelter, the faint light of fires and stars immerse us in the experience of a world where darkness was both literal and symbolic danger. Understanding this environment deepens our appreciation for the resilience required. Simply to endure one night. The passage of night seemed endless, stretching time into a series of small moments, each heavy with anticipation. The mind wandered between memories and fears, conjuring images shaped by tales passed down through generations, stories of lurking spirits, malevolent forces, and the consequences of breaking sacred laws. These narratives framed the night as a time when the veil between the natural and supernatural thinned, heightening both wonder and terror. Sleep, when it came, was often shallow and fragmented. The chill pressed in, seeping through blankets, while dreams danced on the edge of consciousness, sometimes comforting, sometimes haunted by anxiety. The muffled sounds of the villager, an occasional cough, the creak of timber, the distant bark of a dog, provided a soundtrack that kept the senses alert. In some homes, the presence of religious symbols, crosses carved into doorways, holy water sprinkled near beds offered reassurance. The ritual of evening prayers was both a plea for protection and a moment of calm, grounding individuals amidst uncertainty. These acts helped to create a fragile sanctuary within walls vulnerable to the night's threats. The dawn was eagerly awaited, its first light a promise of safety and renewal. The gradual illumination of the sky dispelled shadows, and with them some of the fear that gripped the night. Yet, the memory of darkness lingered, shaping the behavior and psyche of medieval people. The sensory richness of medieval nights, tactile cold, the flickering firelight, the distant howls, the whispered prayers, creates a vivid portrait of a world where surviving darkness required vigilance, courage, and community. This understanding offers a profound appreciation of the human spirit's capacity to endure even the most daunting challenges. The cycle of night and day in the medieval period was not merely a passage of time, but a constant negotiation between safety and danger. As the sun's first rays pierced the horizon, people emerged from their fragile sanctuaries, shaken yet resolute. The darkness that had cloaked their fears retreated, replaced by the familiar sounds and smells of daily life, birdsong, the aroma of baking bread, and the chatter of neighbors.